Hi everybody. Tonight, let me take you on a slow, winding journey, a gentle unraveling of one of the greatest mysteries of our shared human past. Why did the Roman Empire, once the towering beacon of civilization, fall into ruin? This tale will not race toward conclusions, nor thunder with declarations. Instead, we shall wander quietly along the marble halls of ancient Rome, stroll through her bustling marketplaces, and pause among her crumbling ruins, listening for whispers of the past. Together we will explore not a simple answer, but a rich tapestry of reasons, woven with ambition, greed, courage, betrayal, and quiet inevitability. So lay back, let your mind drift, and allow this story to unfold like soft waves upon a quiet shore. For even in the mightiest of empires, the end comes not with a roar, but with a slow, haunting sigh. It begins, as many stories do, with a moment of triumph. The year is 117 AD. Under Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire reaches its zenith, a vast expanse stretching from the windswept moors of Britannia to the shimmering sands of Arabia, from the stormy Atlantic to the rolling hills of Mesopotamia. The roads of Rome are alive with traders, soldiers, scholars, and dreamers. The empire pulses with a steady, unstoppable rhythm. Its legions are feared, its culture admired, its wealth envied. Yet even as Rome basks in golden light, subtle shadows lengthen at the edges of its glory. Trajan's conquests strain the empire's resources. The frontiers grow ever longer, harder to defend. In the bustling forum, senators whisper about rising costs, the burden of supplying distant armies, the whispers of restlessness among the conquered peoples. The heart of Rome beats strong, but faint murmurs of unease echo in its chambers. And then comes Hadrian, Trajan's successor, a thoughtful, cautious man. Where Trajan sought expansion, Hadrian builds walls. Most famously, he orders the construction of a great fortification in distant Britannia, slicing across the rugged northern lands. Hadrian understands a simple truth that few rulers dared speak aloud. Empires grow fat with conquest, but grow weak trying to hold on to it all. With each stone placed along Hadrian's wall, Rome shifts, imperceptibly, inevitably, from bold conqueror to wary guardian of its vastness. It is a subtle turning of the tide. Rome, the eternal city, begins to fear its own boundaries, and yet life continues. The streets of Rome remain crowded with laughter and arguments, markets overflow with exotic goods, amphitheaters echo with the roar of crowds. But deep within the marble corridors of the imperial palace, a silent battle begins, a struggle between emperors and generals, senators and soldiers. For power in Rome is a fickle friend. With an empire so vast, communication slow and loyalty often for sale, generals far from Rome discover a dangerous truth. A legion's love can make or unmake a Caesar. The 3rd century dawns, and with it comes chaos, a time later called the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome teeters on the edge of ruin. Emperors rise and fall with dizzying speed. In 50 years, nearly 25 emperors claim the throne, most by force, few dying of natural causes. Soldiers crown their generals, rivals stab them in their sleep. Barbarian tribes, long held at bay, sense weakness and press the frontiers. The Sassanid Empire in the east surges against Rome's eastern borders. Cities fall, provinces revolt. The coin, once gleaming with imperial promise, becomes a pale, worthless shadow of itself, devalued, debased. The streets of Rome still hum, but beneath the surface cracks spread, hairline fractures of trust, loyalty and identity. It is here, in this age of shadows, that a name rises from the embers: Diocletian. A soldier of humble origins, a man of iron will. In 284 he seizes power, not with the arrogance of a despot, but with the careful hands of a man reforging broken steel. Diocletian does what few dare. He recognizes that Rome's burden is too great for one man to bear. And so he divides it, not in destruction, but in desperate hope of preservation. The empire is split into 2 halves, east and west, each ruled by an emperor and a co-emperor beneath him. It is a bold gamble, a recognition that unity, once Rome's greatest strength, now threatens to become her undoing. Yet even as Diocletian breathes new order into the veins of the empire, a quiet transformation stirs, a shift not of swords, but of souls. A faith once whispered among the shadows begins its ascent. Christianity, born in the dust of distant Judea, spreads across the empire's heart. It grows not by force of arms, but by quiet resilience, a faith of the meek, the oppressed, the hopeful. Rome, the empire of 1,000 gods, begins to bow before a single one. This quiet revolution of spirit will, in time, shape the fate of emperors and empires alike. But for now, let us pause here, standing at the edge of a world caught between old gods and new faiths, between the ambition of emperors and the weariness of a stretched people. For the fall of Rome is no single thunderclap. It is a slow, mournful symphony, a melody of decline played softly across centuries. And tonight we have only just begun to hear its opening notes. In the gentle quiet of twilight, our story winds further into the folds of time. As the 4th century unfurls, the Roman Empire stands, outwardly mended by the careful hands of Diocletian, yet within its vast chambers change stirs like a silent unseen tide. Diocletian's grand experiment, the division of the empire, brings a fleeting calm. The Western Roman Empire, governed from Milan and later Ravenna, holds sway over Europe and North Africa. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its shining capital at Nicomedia, and soon Constantinople, watches over the wealthy provinces of the East. Each half mirrors the other with its emperor and junior emperor, the system known as the Tetrarchy. At first, this division feels like a balm upon old wounds. The pressures of border defense, administration, and law enforcement are eased by shared burdens. The empire's armies, once stretched thin, now find direction under clearer commands. In dusty frontier forts and marble-clad palaces, men speak of order restored, of the old strength returning. But as with all things born of compromise, the peace is fragile, a thin glaze upon simmering ambition. For though Diocletian wields supreme control during his reign, he cannot reign forever. And when he steps down, a rare act of imperial humility, the careful balance he forged begins its slow unravelling. Rivalries reawaken, co-emperors eye each other with suspicion. The harmony of shared rule proves too delicate for human greed and pride. It is in this simmering atmosphere that Constantine rises. A soldier's son, hardened by campaigns and sharpened by palace intrigues, Constantine seizes his destiny upon the death of his father. At first he is but one among many contenders in a fractured empire, yet fortune, cunning, and an unyielding will lift him beyond rivals. His triumph at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, fought beneath the Christian symbol of the Chi Rho, marks a turning point not only in his life, but in the fate of the empire. With Constantine, the narrative of Rome bends toward new horizons. He reunites the fractured empire under his rule, a singular authority in a world weary of squabbling emperors. Yet it is not merely the sword that defines his legacy, but a vision far deeper. Constantine embraces Christianity, not as a whispered faith of the downtrodden, but as a banner under which emperors may rule and empires may stand united. Under his hand, the once persecuted faith rises to prominence. Churches blossom beside temples, bishops gain the ear of rulers, laws bend gently toward the Christian creed. The Edict of Milan, proclaimed in 313 AD, grants Christians freedom of worship, a quiet revolution in a world long defined by the clash of countless gods. And yet, even as Constantine weaves new threads into Rome's tapestry, he stitches in a choice that will echo through centuries. He founds a new capital. On the site of ancient Byzantium, he builds Constantinople, a city of grand walls, gilded domes, and sprawling forums. A jewel upon the Bosphorus, Constantinople rises as a new centre of imperial power, drawing wealth, soldiers, and scholars eastward. Rome, the eternal city, still stands, but her heart begins to slow. The Senate fades into ceremonial whispers. Emperors visit rarely, preferring the grandeur and strategic brilliance of their eastern capital, and beneath this shifting current, the West begins to wither. The division between East and West, once a practical solution, hardens into a growing chasm. The East thrives, its cities wealthy, its trade routes vibrant, its armies strong. The West, burdened by decaying infrastructure, dwindling tax revenues, and increasing threats at its borders, finds itself stumbling under the weight of old glories. Worse still, the empire's legions, once proud sons of Italy, Gaul, and Hispania, become a patchwork of mercenaries and foederati. Germanic tribes, once enemies beyond the Rhine, now serve within the empire's ranks, their loyalty fragile, their swords bought with promises of land and gold. In the quiet corners of Roman villas, landowners murmur of rising taxes and vanishing protection. Farmers abandon their fields, unable to meet imperial demands. The sturdy backbone of the Western Empire, its rural populace, begins to erode. Yet in the soft light of Constantinople's rising sun, such troubles seem distant, almost faint. Constantine's death marks another shift, a passing of a titan into the silence of history. His sons inherit his divided empire, but they inherit, too, the seeds of discord. Infighting returns. Battles between brothers, cousins, and co-emperors drain the empire's lifeblood. The pattern of the 3rd century, of rival emperors and civil war, lurks ever beneath the surface, ready to rise. And all the while, beyond the limes, the world stirs. To the north, Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, press closer, not yet in full invasion, but restless, sensing opportunity. To the east, the Persian Empire watches, ever ambitious, waiting for Rome's attention to falter. And within Rome's very heart, a quiet question begins to whisper in the minds of men and women alike. Is this truly the empire eternal? For though marble still gleams in the sun, though soldiers still march upon Roman roads, the soul of the empire begins to feel fragile. Not broken, not yet, but trembling, as though a great storm looms unseen just beyond the horizon. And so the tale continues, an empire divided, its strength tested, its future uncertain. The mighty Roman world stands poised upon the edge of a slow, creeping twilight, and we, silent travellers in this story, shall follow its path deeper into the soft shadows of decline. Through the quiet mists of the late 4th century, our story glides onward, deeper into the heart of an empire standing unknowingly upon the threshold of its slow undoing. The Roman world, still adorned in imperial splendour, hums with life on the surface. Yet beneath the bustling forums and stately villas, beneath the echoes of marching legions and the murmur of market stalls, a quiet weariness begins to settle upon the Western Roman Empire. It is in these shadowed years that a name rises, a name that will echo with both reverence and unease across the centuries. Theodosius. Theodosius I, known as Theodosius the Great, ascends to power in 379 AD, amidst the smouldering aftermath of a catastrophe, the Battle of Adrianople. It is here on a hot August day in 388 that the Roman world suffers a wound from which it would never fully recover. The Goths, a restless Germanic people pushed westward by the advancing Huns, had been allowed into the empire's borders, nominally as allies, the foederati. Promised land and protection in exchange for service, they were betrayed by corrupt officials, starved and abused. Their anger, sharp as northern ice, ignited into open rebellion. At Adrianople, the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens, dismissing warnings and craving glory, marches against the Gothic forces without waiting for reinforcements. The result is a slaughter. Roman legions, hardened, disciplined, are torn apart by a coalition of cavalry and infantry unlike any they had faced before. Emperor Valens himself perishes in the fray, his body never recovered. The empire reels. Adrianople is not merely a battlefield defeat, it is a shattering of the illusion of invincibility. The walls of the empire, long thought impenetrable, show their first deep cracks. It is into this maelstrom that Theodosius steps. A man of vigour, piety and political cunning, Theodosius takes command of the Eastern Empire. With patience and determination, he stabilizes the eastern provinces, negotiates a fragile peace with the Goths, and restores a semblance of order. But this peace comes at a cost, a silent, profound shift in imperial power. For the first time, barbarian tribes are not just tolerated but settled within Roman borders as autonomous groups, bearing their own leaders, their own laws, serving Rome not as subjects but as uneasy partners. A precedent is set, one that future emperors will find impossible to reverse. Theodosius' reign also cements another quiet revolution. In 380 AD, with the Edict of Thessalonica, he declares Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the empire. The old gods of Rome, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, fade into memory, their temples abandoned or converted, their festivals diminished to echoes. Paganism, once the heartbeat of Roman identity, becomes a shadow on the margins. The empire's soul shifts from the grandeur of Jupiter's thunderbolt to the quiet cross of Christ. But Theodosius, like all men, cannot halt the turning of the world. Upon his death in 395 AD, the empire is divided once more, east to his son Arcadius, west to his son Honorius. This division, unlike those before, hardens into a near-permanent state. And as winter clouds gather over the Western Roman Empire, dark tidings begin their slow, relentless approach. In the west, young Honorius, an emperor in name more than deed, rules from Ravenna, a city chosen for its marshy defences rather than its imperial grandeur. Weak, fearful and easily swayed, Honorius becomes the puppet of powerful generals and court officials. Among them stands Stilicho, a man of Vandal blood, yet fiercely loyal to Rome. A brilliant general, Stilicho shoulders the crumbling burden of the Western Empire's defense. With tactical genius and relentless effort, he holds back the surging tides of invasion. But even Stilicho's strength cannot hold forever. For on the wind rides a new terror, the Visigoths, under their indomitable leader Alaric. Denied fair treatment, disillusioned with Roman promises and seeking a homeland for his people, Alaric turns his gaze toward Italy. His invasions are not a frenzied assault, but a calculated pressure, raids, demands, blockades, a slow tightening of the noose. Stilicho counters him at every turn, his military brilliance buying Rome precious years. Yet the shadows within the empire prove more dangerous than the foes at its gates. Court intrigues swirl, envy, fear, and betrayal fester among the imperial advisors. In a stunning act of treachery, Stilicho is accused of treason, arrested, and executed in 408 AD. His soldiers, feeling betrayed by the court, desert, and the gates begin to fall open. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happens. Alaric, leading his Visigothic warriors, marches upon the heart of the empire, the city of Rome itself. The eternal city, untouched by enemy hands for 800 years, stands exposed. And then it is sacked. Not with the wild frenzy of barbarians often whispered in later tales, but with a cold, methodical thoroughness. Churches are spared, some Roman citizens are left unharmed, yet the city is plundered. Gold, treasures, dignity, all torn from Rome's grasp. The world shudders. Rome, the once untouchable mistress of the world, has fallen, if only for a moment, to foreign hands. A symbol, more powerful than any battlefield loss, now marks the beginning of the end. The West does not collapse overnight. Provinces still hold, armies still march, emperors still wear the purple. But the spell is broken. The world knows now that Rome is no longer invincible. And as the flickering flame of imperial power weakens, darker tides gather beyond the borders, tides that no wall, no army, and no emperor will be able to hold back for long. Our story moves on, soft as the hush of evening winds, deeper into the labyrinth of a world gently crumbling before its own silent dread. The soft shadows of the 5th century deepen, casting long, uncertain veils over the weary Western Roman Empire. The sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 AD ripples like a mournful song across the known world, a grim herald of a twilight no longer theoretical but present, creeping through marble avenues and ivy-clad villas alike. Yet remarkably, Rome endures. The city itself survives the Visigoths' withdrawal, battered but unbroken in spirit. Life resumes among its streets, though quieter, more cautious, laced with a somber awareness that the age of Roman supremacy has shifted forever. In the imperial courts of Ravenna, however, the weight of this new world presses heavy. Honorius, still emperor in name, presides over a crumbling realm, his authority slipping like sand between idle fingers. Though Rome's sack shocked the world, Honorius remains insulated, removed from the suffering of his people, retreating ever deeper into the shadows of courtly intrigue and self-preservation. But beyond the imperial court's reach, the provinces of the Western Empire bear the real cost of this unravelling. In Gaul, the northern borders falter. Waves of Germanic tribes, Suebi, Vandals, Alans, flow across the Rhine in a great, restless surge. Once constrained by Roman might, they now carve their paths through Roman lands, no longer mere raiders but settlers, establishing their own kingdoms on imperial soil. Cities that once bustled under the Pax Romana now fortify themselves, clutching desperately to the memory of order. Roman governors plead for reinforcements, for aid, for anything. Yet too often their cries echo unanswered across the widening void of imperial neglect. Meanwhile, in Britannia, the legions withdraw, called back to defend the heart of the empire. The distant isle, long a symbol of Rome's reach to the ends of the world, is abandoned to its fate. Local warlords and native tribes rise in the void, crafting their own fractured destinies from the crumbling remnants of Roman rule. In Hispania, the same uneasy pattern emerges. The Vandals and Suebi establish their own dominions, slicing through Roman authority with grim efficiency. The once vibrant cities of the Iberian Peninsula dim beneath the shadow of foreign banners. Yet even in these darkened years, figures rise, flickers of resilience in an empire slowly fading. One such figure is Galla Placidia. Daughter of Theodosius the Great, sister of Honorius, and an unwilling participant in the great tides of history, Galla's life reads like a somber legend. Captured by Alaric during the sack of Rome, she is taken across the empire's fractured heartlands, a living prize amid the clash of civilizations. Yet in captivity she survives, and in time weds Ataulf, Alaric's successor. Their union, a rare glimmer of diplomacy amidst the chaos, briefly promises a bridge between Roman and Goth. But peace in these shadowed years proves as fleeting as the morning mist. Ataulf's death, Galla's return to Roman custody, and her forced marriage to the general Constantius III entwine her fate once more with the flickering fortunes of the Western Empire. From captive to empress, her journey embodies both the strength and fragility of an empire tethered to fading glories and uncertain futures. Yet not even the presence of an empress of such stature can stall the empire's slow descent. After Honorius' death, imperial authority passes to Galla Placidia's young son, Valentinian III. Yet as so often before, it is not the emperor who holds power, but those who stand in his shadow. One shadow, darker and more formidable than most, looms tall, Flavius Aetius. A general of singular skill, Aetius navigates the treacherous waters of court politics and foreign threats with unmatched prowess. Known as the last of the Romans by some, his career becomes a bitter testament to the empire's last struggles against the darkening tide. Aetius understands the game as few do. He bends alliances with barbarian tribes, balances power among warring factions, and even maintains a cautious relationship with the looming threat in the east, the Huns. For now, beyond the Danube's restless flow, the Huns stir, a force unlike any the Empire has yet faced. Under the iron will of Attila, they will soon sweep across the landscape like a storm. But that shadow remains, for the moment, on the edge of the horizon. Within the Western Empire, the years pass in a mournful rhythm. The Senate in Rome, once the heart of republican grandeur, fades into ceremonial irrelevance. The imperial court grows ever more entangled in petty rivalries and whispers of betrayal. The legions, no longer the proud sons of Rome's soil, fight under foreign standards or serve for foreign gold. Loyalty shifts with the winds of fortune. Defense of the empire becomes a patchwork quilt of shifting alliances, mercenary pacts, and desperate gambits. Yet amid the decay, the people endure. Merchants still sail the seas, though piracy grows bolder. Farmers tend their fields, though taxes and raids bite deep into their harvests. Craftsmen, priests, and scholars continue their quiet labours beneath crumbling walls and fading mosaics. The Western Roman Empire, though battered, does not fall in a single gasp. It lingers, an empire of shadows and half-remembered glories, clinging to a world, slipping quietly beyond its grasp. And so, as dusk settles upon the 5th century, the stage stands set for a final fateful chapter in this slow, haunting tale. The storm is drawing near, the winds shift, the hourglass turns, and we, gentle travellers of this story, shall follow its soft, sorrowful descent into the waiting night. The quiet dawn of the year 440 settles over a Western Roman Empire weary from endless strains. The sun still rises over Ravenna's marsh-guarded palaces, and Rome's fading grandeur still casts long shadows across the 7 hills. Yet beneath the worn banners of the empire, the world has changed beyond recognition. The emperor, Valentinian III, reigns in name, but his authority lies largely in the capable hands of his Magister Militum, Flavius Aetius. Aetius, the so-called last of the Romans, stands like a lone pillar amidst ruins. His life, woven with the tangled threads of loyalty, cunning, and warfare, embodies the desperate resilience of a collapsing world. Born into a military family and once a hostage among the Huns themselves, Aetius holds a rare understanding of the swirling tides of barbarian politics. It is this understanding that grants him a fragile edge in a world now shaped as much by alliances with foederati as by Roman legions. The Western Empire of his time is no longer the unified titan of centuries past. It is a splintered realm, a mosaic of provinces where Roman governors rule more as local kings than imperial servants, and where barbarian chieftains hold sway over lands once governed by Caesar's hand. In Gaul, the Franks and the Burgundians carved their domains from imperial territories. The Visigoths, once wandering supplicants, have settled into a powerful kingdom in Aquitaine. In Hispania, the Suebi establish a lasting hold, while the Vandals, fierce and cunning, have crossed into North Africa, a province that once fed the heart of the empire with its golden grain. Africa, the empire's breadbasket, is now lost. The Vandals, under their relentless king Genseric, do not merely seize Carthage, they fortify it, making it their stronghold and base of operations. From its harbours, their swift ships slice through the Mediterranean waves, raiding coasts, plundering merchant vessels, and choking the arteries of Roman trade. The Western Empire reels from this loss. Without Africa's grain, Rome itself suffers food shortages. The revenues that once flowed into imperial coffers diminish to a trickle. The once gilded streets of the Eternal City echo with unrest and hunger. But worse than the loss of provinces or even treasure is the creeping loss of confidence, the quiet acceptance among Rome's citizens that the empire is no longer a bulwark against the chaos of the world. Even the mighty Aetius, with all his maneuverings and fragile alliances, cannot hold back every tide. For now, a darker shadow grows in the east, a storm whispered in the trembling voices of envoys and scribes alike. The Huns. No longer mere raiders or passing threats, they coalesce under a leader of chilling charisma and boundless ambition. Attila. Attila the Hun, a name that even the bravest Roman soldier murmurs with wary dread. Tall, fierce, and possessed of an iron will, Attila unites the fractious Hunnic tribes into a relentless force. His warriors ride with a terrifying swiftness, striking like a tempest, leaving desolation in their wake. Settlements vanish, cities pay tribute in trembling submission, and entire provinces quake beneath his gaze. The Eastern Roman Empire, rich and well defended though it may be, feels the bite of Attila's wrath. Cities fall, ransoms are paid, emperors bow, and in time the storm turns westward. In 451 AD, Attila sets his sights on Gaul, a land of divided loyalties and weakened Roman presence. The Huns pour across the Rhine, joined by subject tribes eager for plunder and conquest. The fate of Western Europe hangs upon a knife's edge. And so upon the plains of Catalonian fields near Chalons, a confrontation unfolds, a battle that would echo through the centuries. Aetius, master of fragile alliances, gathers a desperate coalition. Romans, Visigoths under King Theodoric I, Franks, and other foederati join beneath a trembling banner, not out of love for Rome, but from fear of a world devoured by Attila's horde. The battle is brutal, a clash of iron and willpower. Theodoric falls in the fray, yet his men fight on. Aetius maneuvers with deadly precision, halting the Hunnic advance. Though not a decisive Roman victory in the grandest sense, the battle blunts Attila's momentum, a fleeting triumph in a world grown accustomed to defeat. Yet even victories cannot mend a dying empire's wounds. The following year, Attila marches on Italy itself. His armies reach the northern plains, sacking cities with ruthless efficiency. The imperial court trembles. Rome stands undefended, vulnerable once more. But fate intercedes not by sword, but by words. In an event shrouded in legend and soft whispers, Pope Leo the Great rides out to meet Attila. What passes between them remains a mystery, woven with speculation and awe. Yet remarkably, Attila turns back, sparing Rome from another sack. Some say disease and famine stayed his hand. Others whisper of Leo's persuasive words or a hefty ransom. But in the hearts of Romans it is remembered as a miracle, a fleeting mercy amidst relentless doom. Attila's death in 453 AD brings a temporary reprieve. His empire fragments without his iron grip. The Hunnic threat dissipates as swiftly as it had arisen. But the Western Roman Empire, battered by wars, drained of resources and frayed by internal strife, finds no lasting peace. In a bitter twist of fate, Aetius, defender of the empire, architect of fleeting victories, is struck down not by a barbarian sword, but by the hand of his emperor. In 454 AD, Valentinian III, spurred by paranoia and court whispers, assassinates Aetius with his own hand during a palace audience. It is an act of imperial suicide. Valentinian's betrayal of his greatest general alienates the last loyal soldiers and nobles of the West. Within a year, Valentinian himself is murdered by former supporters of Aetius. And thus, the Western Empire staggers into deeper disarray. With its finest defenders gone, its provinces crumbling, and its enemies circling, the empire stands, a hollowed husk of its former self, awaiting the inevitable hand of fate. The hour grows late, the shadows lengthen, and we drift quietly onward into the deepening night of a world that once dared call itself eternal. The silent dusk of the mid-5th century spreads its soft, somber hues over the Western Roman Empire, a fading world adrift in tides of betrayal, ambition, and inevitable decline. The twin deaths of Flavius Aetius and Emperor Valentinian III mark more than the passing of two men. They signal the shattering of what fragile order remained within the crumbling imperial structure. In the quiet that follows, a deeper unraveling begins. The imperial throne of the West, once a seat of iron will and sweeping power, becomes a mere ornament, a prize passed between generals, usurpers, and foreign kings. Where once emperors strode as masters of the world, now they linger as puppets, raised and toppled by the whims of others. Amid this turmoil, a man of barbarian blood rises, Ricimer. A commander of mixed Suebi and Visigoth heritage, Ricimer holds no imperial title, yet he wields the true power behind the fading throne. With cunning unmatched and a soldier's ruthlessness, he becomes the kingmaker of the Western Empire, elevating and discarding emperors like pawns in a desperate game of survival. From 456 onward, Ricimer shapes the fate of the West through a shadowy rule. He raises Avitus, a Gallic noble, to the purple, only to depose him within a year when the tides of favour shift. Majorian follows, a soldier emperor of rare talent and genuine resolve. For a fleeting moment, it seems the empire may breathe anew. Majorian rides across Gaul, battles rebellious tribes, and even dreams of reclaiming Africa from the Vandals. Yet dreams in this fading world often meet harsh ends. Ricimer, wary of Majorian's growing independence, engineers his downfall. In 461 AD, Majorian is captured and executed, his death another whisper in the long dirge of Rome's demise. One by one, emperors rise and fall, Severus III, Anthemius, Olybrius, all mere shadows beneath Ricimer's unseen hand. Yet even Ricimer, master manipulator though he is, cannot halt the crumbling walls around him. For outside Ravenna's fortified courts, the empire's provinces continue to slip away like leaves on an autumn wind. In Gaul, the Visigoths under King Euric press ever deeper, carving out a kingdom independent in all but name. In Hispania, the Suebi thrive unchecked, while the Vandals in Africa remain defiant, pirates of the Mediterranean, lords of the western seas. Even Italy itself, the heartland of Rome, grows restless. The Foederati, Germanic mercenaries settled within the empire, grow bold. No longer content with meagre pay and vague promises, they begin to see Italy not as a host, but as a prize to be seized. The Roman Senate, a hollow echo of its former grandeur, murmurs in impotent protest. The once mighty legions are shadows of their former selves, thin ranks of mercenaries scattered and unreliable. And then, in 472 AD, Ricimer dies. The puppeteer's hand falls still, and with it the fragile structure of his power crumbles. In his wake rises Orestes, a Roman general of Pannonian origin, once a secretary to Attila himself. In a world now shaped by the mingling of Roman and barbarian, Orestes stands as a symbol of that blurred divide. But Orestes does not seize the throne for himself. Instead, in a calculated move, he elevates his young son, Romulus. Romulus Augustus, known to history with a bitter touch of irony as Augustulus, the little Augustus. A boy emperor, crowned in 475 AD, seated upon a throne already cracked and fading. Romulus, scarcely more than a child, becomes the last emperor of the West, a symbol not of Rome's grandeur but of its last fragile gasp. But the empire he nominally rules is emperor in name alone. Italy itself stands on the brink. The Foederati, led by Odoacer, a chieftain of uncertain origin, perhaps Syrian or Gothic, demand land in return for service. Orestes refuses, hoping to preserve some shred of Roman authority. The response is swift and merciless. In 476 AD, Odoacer marches on Italy. Orestes is captured and executed. Ravenna, the imperial seat, falls with scarcely a struggle. Romulus Augustus is deposed, not slain, but quietly sent away, granted a pension and a villa by the magnanimous Odoacer. The Western Roman Empire ends not with a final battle, nor with a grand declaration, but with a soft, inevitable sigh. No great armies clash for its defense. No final emperor falls valiantly upon his sword. The world simply shifts, and the empire, once the master of all lands from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, slips gently into memory. Odoacer does not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he rules Italy as king, acknowledging the theoretical supremacy of the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople. But in practice, a new era dawns, the age of the barbarian kingdoms. The Western Roman Empire dies not in fire and ruin, but in quiet acceptance of its irrelevance. Yet even as the purple fades from Italy's skies, life moves on. Farmers tend their fields, merchants ply their trade along the old Roman roads. Churches rise where temples once stood. The memory of Rome lingers, not as a living empire, but as a dream woven into the heart of Europe. The world turns, soft and slow, into a new age. The dream of Rome, though ended in reality, becomes a legend, a quiet echo that will murmur through the centuries to come. And we, silent travellers in this soft-falling night, pause at the gentle close of an empire whose fall was not a single blow, but a slow, sorrowful fading into the gathering dusk. The night that followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 was not a night of fire or mourning. It was a quiet, almost unnoticed turning of the page, a soft closing of a long and weathered book whose chapters had grown thinner with each passing decade. Across the broad stretches of Italy, life stirred much as it always had. The sun rose over the 7 hills of Rome. The Tiber still flowed in its ancient, silent course. Markets opened, farmers tended their fields, and artisans worked their trades. Yet beneath this calm rhythm, the world had changed. Odoacer, the new ruler of Italy, styled himself not emperor but king, a rex. He held no imperial purple, bore no Roman diadem. His rule marked a shift that had been creeping for generations. The transition from the imperial might of Rome to the patchwork of kingdoms that would shape medieval Europe. And yet Odoacer was no savage conqueror, nor a destroyer of the Roman legacy. In his reign, he sought to preserve what still functioned of Roman administration. The Senate remained, if only as a ceremonial body. The laws of Rome continued in use. The coinage bore familiar faces. The old machinery of governance, though creaking and brittle, still turned beneath his hands. But though the forms remained, the spirit of empire, its far-reaching authority, its unifying presence, had slipped away like mist at dawn. Far to the east, in the golden city of Constantinople, the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire observed this quiet fall with wary detachment. The Eastern emperors, secure within their marble-walled palaces, acknowledged Odoacer as patrician, a title steeped in the formalities of Roman tradition. Yet even they sensed that something irreplaceable had been lost. For the Western Empire had been more than a political entity. It had been a symbol, a vast, living idea of order, civilization, and dominion over a chaotic world. With its passing, Europe entered a time of shifting shadows. In Gaul, the Visigoths expanded their domain, pressing southward and westward, carving out a kingdom whose power grew with each passing year. Their kings styled themselves not as usurpers, but as rightful rulers, a new nobility born from the ashes of imperial collapse. In Hispania, the Suabian Visigoths divided the land among themselves. Roman towns survived in pockets, their citizens now subjects of foreign kings. The law of Rome mingled with the customs of the tribes, weaving a strange hybrid tapestry of rule. In North Africa, the Vandals under Genseric continued their reign from Carthage, their ships haunting the Mediterranean like dark spectres. Their kingdom, though feared, became a fixture of the New World Order, a maritime power born of piracy and conquest. And in Britannia, long abandoned by Roman legions, the Anglo-Saxons pressed inland, seizing lands once held by Roman governors. The echoes of Roman Britain faded beneath waves of new languages, customs, and kingships. The great network of Roman roads, once the veins of empire, became silent pathways trodden by wandering monks, traders, and raiders alike. The grand amphitheatres and baths crumbled slowly into ruins, their stones repurposed for humble cottages and fortresses. Yet even in this fading world, Rome's shadow lingered. The Latin language remained the tongue of law, church, and scholarship. Roman law, though eroded and adapted, underpinned the codes of emerging kingdoms. The idea of Romanitas, of being Roman, survived in the hearts of many, a quiet yearning for the order and glory of a vanished age. But perhaps the most enduring heir of Rome was not a king or emperor, but a bishop. In the heart of the eternal city, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, rose in quiet prominence. With the empire gone, the papacy became the guardian of Roman tradition and faith. It was the Pope, more than any lingering senator or warlord, who held the threads of continuity. The Roman Church, with its rituals, Latin liturgy, and claims of apostolic succession, became the living memory of an empire that had passed into history. Pope Simplicius, who witnessed the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, quietly continued his ministry in the shadow of political collapse. The Church endured as a beacon of stability in a world darkened by uncertainty. And so, the fall of Rome was not the end, but a transformation, a slow, mournful passage from one era to another. It was a passing not of sudden ruin, but of gradual change. 1,000 small deaths, 1,000,000 whispered farewells, the shifting of alliances, the fading of armies, the silent repurposing of temples into churches, of forums into marketplaces. It was in this gentle fading that Europe entered the early Middle Ages, a world where the memory of Rome lingered like the soft echo of a once great song, haunting the halls of kings and the prayers of priests alike. Odoacer ruled until 493 AD, when another figure from the misted lands of the north arrived to carve his name upon Italy's fate, Theodoric the Ostrogoth. But that, too, was part of the slow unwinding of Rome's long shadow. For though emperors fell and kingdoms rose, the idea of Rome, the dream of order, civilization, and eternal legacy, would never truly die. It would sleep, silent and deep, beneath the fields and forests of a changing world, waiting for the day when its echoes would rise once more upon the lips of kings and emperors yet to come. And we, patient travellers of this quiet, sorrowful tale, shall follow these echoes further, deeper into the soft, unfolding night of history's longest twilight. The twilight of the Western Roman Empire gave way not to darkness, but to a muted, uncertain dawn, a world reshaped by the soft erosion of empire and the steady rise of new powers. In this reshaped world, the name of Rome no longer stirred legions to march, nor senators to debate. Yet it lingered like a half-remembered song, humming faintly beneath the daily rhythms of a changing Europe. When Odoacer seized power in Italy, many thought him the herald of a new age. He ruled with a mixture of pragmatism and deference to Roman tradition, keeping the Senate intact, maintaining Roman laws and preserving the titles of old, even as he distributed lands to his barbarian followers. But in Constantinople, Emperor Zeno watched with wary eyes. Though the Eastern Empire had long distanced itself from the crumbling West, the fall of the Western throne disturbed the careful balance of power. Zeno found an answer not in legions, but in an alliance, a dark pact with a man who would soon cast his own long shadow upon the Italian lands. Theodoric the Ostrogoth. Born into the royal Amal family of the Ostrogoths, Theodoric was a prince hardened by a childhood spent as a political hostage in Constantinople. There, in the grand palaces and golden halls of the Byzantine court, he learned the ways of empire, its politics, its culture, and its weaknesses. Returning to his people as a seasoned leader, Theodoric became more than a mere chieftain. He was a man poised between two worlds, barbarian and Roman, conqueror and custodian. In 488 AD, with Zeno's blessing, Theodoric led his people westward into Italy, not as invaders, but as supposed restorers of imperial order. His mission, to depose Odoacer and establish a new realm under his command, all while upholding the traditions of Roman governance. The war that followed was brutal and drawn out, a conflict of sieges, battles, and shifting alliances. For nearly 5 years, Italy became a land caught between two kings, its cities battered by war, its people worn thin by endless uncertainty. Finally, in 493 AD, a fragile truce was declared. Odoacer and Theodoric agreed to share rule over Italy, a compromise forged in weariness and necessity. But compromise, in those shadowed years, seldom held. During a great banquet in Ravenna, meant to celebrate their alliance, Theodoric struck. In a moment as shocking as it was inevitable, he slew Odoacer with his own hand, killing him before his gathered court. Theodoric's victory was absolute. Yet unlike so many conquerors, Theodoric did not rule as a barbarian warlord. Instead, he embraced the mantle of a Roman ruler in all but name. He respected the Senate, upheld Roman law, and worked to restore Italy's battered economy and infrastructure. Under his reign, Italy experienced a strange, fleeting revival. Aqueducts were repaired, roads were maintained. The arts, long dormant, stirred once more in the cities of the peninsula. Theodoric ruled with a steady hand, balancing the demands of his Gothic warriors with the delicate pride of the Roman aristocracy. Though a devout Arian Christian, a faith considered heretical by the Orthodox Church, Theodoric practiced a remarkable degree of religious tolerance for his time. Catholics, Arians, and even Jews lived with a measure of peace under his rule. It was, in many ways, a brief echo of the Pax Romana, a twilight reflection of a world long past. Yet even Theodoric, wise and shrewd though he was, could not escape the currents of distrust that swirled beneath the surface of his fragile kingdom. The division between his Gothic followers and the Roman population remained a wound that never healed. The Goths held military power, controlled key offices, and enjoyed the lion's share of privilege. The Romans, though spared overt oppression, resented their foreign rulers and longed for a return to a lost imperial past. In Constantinople, the Eastern emperors watched Theodoric's reign with guarded interest. They recognized his authority in name, yet remained wary of his growing independence. The dream of a reunited Roman world flickered faintly in their hearts, even as they knew the gulf between East and West had grown too wide to bridge. As the years passed, Theodoric's rule remained strong, but shadows deepened around him. Plots brewed, trust frayed, and in the final years of his life, suspicion clouded his judgment. One of the most haunting episodes came with the execution of Boethius, a Roman senator, philosopher, and statesman. Accused of treason and conspiracy with Constantinople, Boethius met his end in a dark cell, far from the marble halls of his youth. His death marked not just the fall of a man, but the quiet end of hope for a lasting harmony between the Gothic rulers and their Roman subjects. Theodoric died in 526 AD, a king of complex legacy, remembered both as a wise ruler and a ruthless conqueror. With his passing, the fragile balance he had maintained began to crumble. His successors lacked his vision and strength. The Gothic kingdom of Italy entered a slow descent, pulled apart by internal strife, mounting distrust, and the ever-watchful eyes of Constantinople. The dream of a Roman revival faded once more, like the soft extinguishing of a candle in the encroaching dark. And so the world turned, a little colder, a little quieter. The shadows of empire lingered in the ruins of aqueducts, the faint outlines of Latin inscriptions, and the whispered prayers within ancient basilicas. But the heart of Rome, the mighty empire that had once ruled the known world, slipped ever further into memory, a gentle, sorrowful fading into the soft hush of history's long, unbroken night. And we, slow voyagers of this tale, drift ever onward with it, into the deepening dusk of a world that had once called itself eternal. As the 6th century unfolded, the faint embers of Roman legacy in the West flickered dimmer still, casting long shadows upon a Europe reshaped by new rulers and ancient memories. Theodoric the Ostrogoth's reign, though brief in the grand passage of time, had been a fragile bridge. A slender arch stretched between the fading grandeur of the Roman Empire and the rising tide of barbarian kingdoms. With his death in 526 AD, that bridge began to crumble beneath the weight of mistrust, rivalry, and relentless ambition. His grandson Athalaric inherited the throne of the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy. Yet Athalaric was but a child, and governance fell into the hands of his mother, Amalasuntha, a woman of Roman education and Gothic blood. Wise, cultured, and fluent in Latin and Greek, Amalasuntha sought to preserve her father's fragile vision of coexistence between Goths and Romans. But the world she ruled was a tinderbox of suspicion. The Gothic nobility resented her Roman sympathies, her education, and her open hand toward Constantinople. They viewed her as a queen more Roman than Gothic, a ruler who betrayed their warrior traditions for the soft civility of a fallen empire. Amalasuntha struggled against the rising tide of discontent. When her son Athalaric died young, his life marred by the indulgence and recklessness encouraged by his Gothic tutors, her position grew perilous. Desperate to secure her power, she married her cousin Theodahad, hoping to bind the fracturing kingdom with a union of bloodlines. It proved a fatal miscalculation. Theodahad, more schemer than sovereign, turned upon Amalasuntha. In 535 AD, she was seized and imprisoned. Her murder, likely sanctioned by Theodahad himself, sent a chilling message across the Mediterranean, a message that stirred an emperor in Constantinople to action. That emperor was Justinian I. Known to history as Justinian the Great, he ruled the Eastern Roman Empire with a relentless vision, a dream of restoring the lost western provinces to imperial control, of reuniting the shattered halves of the once mighty Roman world. In the gleaming capital of Constantinople, amid the soaring domes and marble courts, Justinian prepared for war, not with mere armies, but with a grand vision of imperial resurrection. And so, in 535 AD, the Gothic War began. Justinian dispatched his most brilliant general, Belisarius, a man of rare military genius and quiet dignity. With a relatively small force, Belisarius landed in Sicily, the ancient granary of the empire, and seized it with little resistance. From there, he pressed into mainland Italy, beginning a campaign marked by sieges, cunning maneuvers and brutal warfare. The war for Italy would last nearly 2 decades, a protracted, grinding conflict that bled the peninsula dry. At first, victories came swiftly. Rome itself fell to Belisarius in 536 AD, an event marked not by conquest alone but by the haunting echoes of past glory. The Eternal City, so long battered by war and neglect, welcomed the imperial banners of the East with a fragile hope. A hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the empire had returned. But war in those years was never simple. The Goths, though battered, refused to yield. Under new leaders like Witiges and later Totila, they mounted fierce resistance. Cities changed hands multiple times. Battles raged from the Po Valley to the walls of Naples. The countryside, once fertile and rich, became a wasteland of scorched fields and abandoned villages. Rome itself suffered horribly. Besieged, starved, and fought over, the city endured more in those years than it had in centuries past. The Gothic War drained both sides, an agonizing, slow unraveling of men, resources, and hope. Belisarius, though brilliant, was often hampered by court politics and imperial suspicion. Justinian, wary of his general's growing fame, withheld reinforcements and meddled in strategy. The war dragged on, consuming countless lives and leaving behind a shattered landscape. Finally, in 554 AD, after years of bloodshed, the Eastern Roman Empire reclaimed Italy under the command of another general, Narses. The Goths, broken and leaderless, faded into the shadows of history. The dream of Roman restoration, however, proved a hollow triumph. The war had devastated Italy. Its cities lay in ruins. Its population, decimated by famine, plague, and war, dwindled to a fraction of its former strength. Trade collapsed. The very heart of Roman civilization beat faint and slow, its pulse barely audible in the stillness of a ravaged land. And even this fragile victory was fleeting. In the shadows of Europe, new powers stirred, tribes and kingdoms watching with hungry eyes. The Lombards, a Germanic people from the north, pressed into the vacuum left by the Gothic collapse. In 568 AD, scarcely 14 years after the Gothic War's end, they invaded Italy, sweeping across its weakened lands with grim efficiency. The Eastern Roman forces, stretched thin and weary, could do little to halt their advance. And so the cycle resumed, a relentless pattern of invasion, occupation, and fragile rule. Justinian's grand vision of a restored empire faded with the passing of his reign. His conquests, though dazzling on maps, proved brittle in reality, brief flickers of imperial light swallowed swiftly by the deepening dusk of post-Roman Europe. The Western world did not rise anew in Rome's image. It reshaped itself into something different, something harsher and more fragmented. Kings ruled where emperors had once commanded. The memory of the empire lingered in law codes, church councils, and faded mosaics, but the reality of Roman power became a ghost. And thus, even the mighty hand of Constantinople could not pull the West from its slow, sorrowful descent into the soft shadows of the early medieval age. The dream of Rome, once a roaring fire, burned now only as a quiet ember in a world that moved ever further from the age of emperors. And we, quiet keepers of this mournful tale, drift onwards still, following the soft echoes of a world where even the greatest empires must one day surrender to the long and gentle fading of time. The Roman wind had grown softer, whispering through the time-worn stones of the empire. In this 10th part of our tale, we leave the shimmering peaks of the Augustan age behind and enter deeper into the worn corridors of the later empire. The light has yet to dim fully, but dusk has begun to fall, and in that gentle twilight, the processes that would bring Rome to its knees are quietly stirring. It was in this age that the boundaries of the Roman world began to blur. The long-lashed frontiers, which once stood as protective walls of unwavering discipline, were no longer bastions of unity. Rather, they had grown familiar with compromise. Along the Danube and the Rhine, once unyielding cohorts became accustomed to negotiation. Tribal leaders, Goths, Vandals, Franks, were not always met with force. Sometimes they were met with tokens of respect, a title here, a payment there. At first, these gestures were subtle, intended as expedients rather than a transformation. But over time, the empire's stance shifted from dominance to entanglement, its greatest strength transforming slowly into fragility. Those on the fringes of Roman civilization had a new role: allies. The empire hungered for stability and labor. By allowing barbarian peoples to settle within its boundaries, Rome tried to turn former adversaries into partners. Lush farmlands around abandoned villas were rekindled by Gothic ploughs. Roman citizens welcomed newcomers who tended their fields, contributing taxes and manpower. The arrangement glowed with promise. In the cool wash of morning and the hush of evening, shepherds and Roman farmers spoke the same tongue, exchanged goods and perhaps even stories, delicate threads weaving a fragile tapestry of coexistence. Yet beneath the gentle facade was a seed of division. Culture, subtle and insidious, began to shift. Children of mixed lineage learned different songs by hearthlight. In the basilicas, Latin mingled with Gothic dialects. The pulse of tradition faltered. The Senate, once furnished with dignified gravitas, found itself bewildered by unfamiliar faces in familiar robes. Decisions once guided strictly by Roman law became coloured by the law of consensus, or worse, of influence. The boundaries between citizen and outsider, ally and invader, grew porous. In scenes of everyday life, market stalls in urban piazzas, olive groves at sunrise, soldiers marching in the pale daylight, the signs of change were as gentle as they were profound. A legionnaire no longer felt the same allegiance to a distant emperor seated in opulent Constantinople. Instead, his loyalty might linger toward his general, the man who had shared hardship in the misty forests of Gaul or the marshes of Pannonia. And that was not a betrayal of Rome, it was human nature. But when generals became stronger than emperors, when barbarian allies commanded legions rather than mere auxiliary forces, the first cracks appeared in the empire's foundation. Let us wander next into the heart of the imperial court, where the slow turn of events was perhaps less apparent but just as important. Here sat the emperors, heirs to ages of conquest and glory. Their power flickered, sometimes no more than a candle's flame in a draughty hall. Some were puppet rulers, their strings pulled by powerful ministers, eunuchs, or even barbarian factions. Others wielded swords more significant than their scepters, declaring themselves masters of Rome yet struggling to retain even its fringes. Each carried the heavy weight of expectation. But as palaces became arenas of intrigue, the image of unity faded behind a fog of suspicion. Courtiers whispered in grand corridors. Alliances formed in silk-draped chambers grew cold as blades were sharpened. The imperial aura, once a swift current that lifted the whole empire, now splintered into regional interests. East and west, upper and lower Danube, the rich oases of Africa and the swamps of North Gaul. Autonomy spread like vines over crumbling walls. In secret, gates that had once stood open to any loyal Roman could be closed by willful decree. The harmony of provinces, woven through centuries by shared identity, citizenship, coins, frayed until each region hummed to its own tune. Amid this political unspooling, the broader world outside grew restless. Climate shifts, barely noticed at first, crept across the land. Crops that once thrived in Sicily or North Africa began to falter. Occasional famine gnawed at the edges of society, giving sirens of unrest reason to sing. Grain shortage was no longer a distant scare. Sometimes it struck directly, causing riotous wings of plebeians in the great cities to howl for relief. The emperors, accustomed to ordering shipments from newly acquired territories, now faced lands that could not deliver. Silver coins became scarcer, taxation increased, fear and resentment grew. Church bells rang out in the morning dew, not to summon warriors but to gather the faithful. The church, once one among many sects, had grown more than a spiritual haven. It was now an institution of power that reached every corner of the empire. Bishops advised emperors, bishops answered to their congregations. Within temples and basilicas, the mighty stories of Christ took shape. For many, these stories provided a more potent anchor than the distant tales of Romulus or the laurels of victory at Actium. A spiritual unity bloomed, even as political unity waned, a new bond forming amid the ruins of the old. In these hallowed halls, prayers rose like incense. They offered comfort, but also subtle questions. What is the kingdom of heaven compared to an empire destined to crumble? If Rome was meant to stand forever, why did its sun set? The old gods, it seemed, had fallen silent, and their temples, once vibrant centers of civic life, were now shadowed or repurposed. The transformation was gradual, a Christian cross carved into marble long before the altar underwent its consecration. And yet this shift affected the soul of Rome. It questioned identity and purpose. In the vulnerabilities it revealed, the final unaffordable truth: Rome was more fragile than it had ever allowed itself to think. Let us linger on that word, fragile. It is not dramatic, it breathes softly, almost unremarked, and yet it is the fulcrum on which our story balances. For centuries, Rome had believed in its own immortality. The walls, the legions, the emperors, it all seemed eternal. But fragility had taken root, in spilling power across too many generals, in pointing its grain ships to struggling provinces, in surrendering loyalty to local ties rather than to the distant throne. Our journey, guided by lantern light, now reveals the outlines of a new horizon. The horizon is not yet ablaze. There is no cataclysm, no thunderous collapse. Instead, there is the slow loosening of threads of trust, of tradition, of authority, of economy. Like a tapestry left damp and to the elements, the colours have begun to run, the patterns have started to fade. Yet to the casual eye, the ancient beauty remained intact. Only upon careful, lingering glance does one see that something vital had been lost. In this 10th reflection, we meet the Roman Empire at its own twilight. Not the blaze of an ending, but the deepening hush. The soldiers still stand guard, but their hearts pull at other banners. The governors still carry forth edicts, but the legal weight behind them has become a whisper compared to earlier centuries. The church still raises prayers, but the emperors feel their presence like the depths of earth, invisible but heavy. The edges of the world are no longer defined by straight lines on a map, but by shifting alliances and uncertain loyalties. Tonight, as you drift into quiet, imagine the marble halls filled with the low murmur of disquiet, the soft steps of soldiers departing campfires at dawn, the distant toll of a bishop's bell, the sputter of a dying lamp in the imperial chamber. These are not the grand echoes of empire, but the intimate murmurs of an edifice unraveling, not in panic, not in conquest, but in the hush of years. And in that hush, softer than the fall of a leaf, lies the fragile human heart of history. Tomorrow will reveal more threads in the tapestry, the shifting alliances of generals, the sweeping migrations of peoples stirred by hope and fear, the great figure of Constantine and the rise of Constantinople as a new capital of a changed world. But tonight, let the hush remain. Let the wind stir once more through those cracked walls. Let our thoughts drift, infused with soft curiosity. How did an empire so vast begin to ease its grip? How did silence claim the corridors once filled with triumphant song? If sleep visits you now, may it be gentle, and may the echoes of the Twilight Empire whisper softly in your mind. We will continue, step by step, through the corridors of shifting faith, fractured power, and whispered betrayals. But for now, linger. Let the hush of Rome's twilight settle. The wind that moved softly through the heart of the empire now carried with it a colder breath, a whisper of unease that threaded its way along the long roads of Rome. In this 11th chapter of our quiet journey, we find ourselves drawn not to the grand palaces of emperors nor the sacred halls of bishops, but to the marching camps and silent watchtowers where the soul of Rome's power had long dwelt, the legions. For centuries, the legions of Rome had been the iron heart of its dominion. They were more than soldiers. They were symbols of order, of discipline, of the unwavering authority of the emperor. Each standard they bore, each polished breastplate, each precisely stepped march, was a reminder to the world that Rome stood eternal. The legions had conquered Gaul, subdued Britannia, held the line at the edges of the known world. But now, under the soft shadow of the late empire, they began to change in ways both subtle and profound. At first, it seemed harmless. The long campaigns and endless borders had worn down the native Roman manpower. Recruitment among Roman citizens dwindled, not from cowardice, but from a shifting world where farming, trade, and the pursuit of spiritual peace seemed more worthy callings than the endless slog of military life. The legions opened their arms to new blood, the sons of provincials, the hardy tribesmen from the north, the fierce horsemen from the steppes. They were fierce, loyal in their way, but their hearts did not always beat with the same rhythm as the marble-clad legions of old. In the dawn's hush, around campfires beneath the pale sweep of the stars, these new soldiers spoke their own tongues, sang their own songs. The Latin commands still echoed in drills, but the hearts of the men grew bound not to Rome itself, but to their leaders, their generals, their local commanders, those who had shared hunger and danger with them in the far corners of the world. The idea of Rome became distant, abstract, a place of tax collectors and imperial decrees, far removed from the muddy boots and the crackling fires of the frontier. And then, quietly, came the mercenaries. At first, their arrival was a matter of expedience. The empire's coffers, strained by endless wars and the weight of an expanding bureaucracy, could no longer afford to maintain the vast professional army of old. Mercenary bands, often made up of entire tribal groups, were invited into the ranks. Their leaders offered titles, lands, even Roman citizenship. These federates, as they came to be known, bore arms for the empire, guarded its borders, and sometimes even fought in its civil wars. They fought for pay, for land, for promises whispered in marble halls, but rarely for Rome itself. In the quiet of the barracks, as dawn broke with pale light across frost-covered fields, the whispers began. The loyalty of the army was no longer a certainty. A general with enough silver, enough promises of plunder, could command more hearts than a distant emperor ever could. The soldiers' oaths, once sworn with solemn pride before the standards of the Senate and people of Rome, became words uttered for formality, quickly forgotten in the rush of campaigns and shifting alliances. And with this change, the empire's heart began to stutter. The frontier legions, once a shield of steel, now served as bargaining chips in the endless games of politics. Ambitious generals rose, not always from Rome's noble families, but sometimes from barbarian stock, men of charisma and ruthless skill who could command the loyalty of thousands. They were not traitors in their own eyes. They fought for survival, for reward, for power, in a world where the old rules had grown soft. Yet in doing so, they tore at the threads of unity that had bound the empire together. Among them was Stilicho, the Vandal general, who rose to become the guardian of the Western Empire. His loyalty to the Roman state was genuine, but even Stilicho's power lay not in the decrees of the emperor, but in the swords of the federate troops who followed him. In his shadow, other generals, Alaric among them, began to realize their own power. The Gothic king, once a federate commander under Roman banners, saw that the empire's reliance on foreign troops gave him leverage undreamed of by his ancestors. The armies no longer marched solely for the glory of Rome. They marched for survival, for conquest, for the personal gain of their leaders. The empire's enemies recognized the shift. They saw Roman generals turning their swords against each other, rival emperors vying for a fractured throne, and they understood the deeper truth. Rome's heart was softening. Its armies, the shield that had guarded the civilized world for centuries, had become tools in the hands of opportunists and usurpers. Civil wars erupted with increasing frequency, each a slow, grinding wound upon the body of the empire. Soldiers who might have defended the Rhine or the Danube instead fought in Italy, in Gaul, in the eastern provinces. Blood spilled not for defense, but for ambition. The empire cannibalized its own strength, tearing itself apart in slow, relentless conflict. Each battle drained men, treasure, and, perhaps most importantly, the very will of the people to believe in Rome's destiny. In the long evenings, in garrison towns and border camps, veterans told stories of the old days, of legions that marched under emperors whose names stirred pride. But those days felt like the fading echoes of a song. Now, the soldiers spoke of chieftains and generals, of coin and land, of raids and plunder. The empire's armies had not vanished, their banners still flew. But the spirit within had shifted quietly, inevitably. Beyond the borders, the barbarian tribes watched and waited. They saw the internal conflicts, the mercenaries turned rebels, the emperors deposed by their own guards. And they understood. A barrier that had once seemed unbreakable was now riddled with cracks. The legions, Rome's ancient shield, still shone in the sunlight, but the iron beneath was rusting. And yet, even in this quiet erosion, there was no sudden fall, no thunderous collapse. The transformation was like a slow tide creeping over the sand, subtle and persistent. It was in the choices made by desperate emperors, in the ambitions of warlords, in the silent compromises of soldiers who no longer believed in the greatness they once served. As we stand now at this quiet turning point, imagine the campfires burning low in the chilly night air, the soft murmur of soldiers speaking in a dozen tongues, the quiet sharpening of swords before the dawn. The heart of Rome's power still beat, but each thud echoed with a deeper uncertainty. The legions remained, but not as they had been. and in their quiet transformation we see the reflection of an empire slowly shifting from unity to fragments, from order to chaos, from the enduring marble of eternity to the brittle cracks of a fading dream. Tonight, let your mind rest with the gentle thought of soldiers on the frontier, neither villains nor heroes, but men caught in the soft unraveling of a world they could not fully understand. And as sleep approaches, let the soft footfalls of these forgotten legions echo faintly in your dreams, whispering of a glory slowly yielding to the patient tide of time. In the stillness of the 12th chapter of our unfolding tale, we turn our gaze toward the golden domes and marble spires of Constantinople, a city born from the ambitions of emperors and destined to stand as both a beacon and a mirror to a divided world. It was here, amid the soft lapping of the Bosporus and the gentle cries of seabirds at dawn, that the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire beat with a peculiar vitality, even as the West began its slow surrender to shadows. The foundation of Constantinople was not an accident of history, but a deliberate act of vision. Constantine the Great, whose name would echo through centuries, had seen the shifting tides of power and moved with an instinct born of both political acumen and an almost divine sense of destiny. Where once Byzantium had stood, a modest city perched between continents, he summoned forth a new capital, a new Rome, clad not in the fading laurels of ancient victories, but in the fresh vigor of imperial ambition. Constantinople rose, crowned with gilded churches and solemn forums, its streets thrumming with the pulse of trade and the soft murmur of prayers. It was a city born of stone and faith, where the East's wealth flowed like a silent river. Spices from India, silks from China, gold from Africa, all found their way to its markets. The city's walls, formidable and seemingly invincible, stood as silent sentinels against both sea and land. They were not merely defensive structures, but symbols of endurance, of strength, of a Rome reborn in the East. And yet, within the serene beauty of its mosaics and sunlit forums, lay a quiet divergence. Constantinople was Rome, and yet it was not. Its language, though still adorned with Latin's elegance, leaned increasingly toward the soft cadence of Greek. Its emperors bore the title of Augustus, yet their courts pulsed with Eastern rituals, silken robes and customs far removed from the marble senate houses of old. Here, Christianity blossomed not as a persecuted sect, but as the heart of imperial identity, a faith entwined with statecraft, casting long shadows across policy and power. The emperors of the East ruled with a blend of ancient tradition and new necessity. They held the diadem with the gravity of Rome's legacy, yet they moved deftly through the intricate webs of Eastern diplomacy, threading alliances and treaties with kingdoms, tribes, and distant emperors alike. Their world was not the same as the one their forebears had known. The Eastern Empire, with Constantinople at its heart, stood at the crossroads of civilizations, a gatekeeper between Europe and Asia, Christendom and the myriad faiths beyond. But while Constantinople gleamed with a brilliance undimmed by the West's slow decay, the divide between the two halves of the empire grew more than geographical. It became spiritual, cultural, and, in time, inevitable. In the quiet hours before dawn, scholars and priests within Constantinople's cloisters whispered of unity, of the single empire ordained by God. Yet the reality outside their cloistered walls spoke of fragmentation. The emperors of the East sent aid, gold and soldiers to the embattled West, but each act felt less like a gesture of familial duty and more like a reluctant obligation. The Western Empire became a fragile sibling, one whose burdens the East could bear only for so long. Trade routes shifted subtly under the weight of new centers of power. The riches of the East no longer flowed westward as they once had, but circled closer to Constantinople's harbors. Rome itself, that ancient city of 7 hills, faded in both wealth and relevance. Its senators, once the voice of an empire, became symbolic relics, their authority hollowed by the pull of Constantinople's distant throne. The West watched, quietly resentful, as the East prospered amid the growing storm. Yet Constantinople's splendor came not without its own shadows. The city, though a marvel of construction and culture, bore the seeds of isolation. Its wealth, its strength, its near impenetrable walls fostered a sense of separateness, a subtle arrogance that whispered in its golden chambers. The East viewed the West as a land of decay, of fading traditions clinging to old glories. And the West, in turn, began to see the East not as a saviour, but as a distant, indifferent cousin, content to watch as the Western world unravelled. Through the shifting seasons, this silent rift grew. The emperors of Constantinople, draped in silks and flanked by eunuchs and patriarchs, wielded their authority with a mixture of diplomacy and divine right. They engaged with the Persian kings, parleyed with barbarian tribes, and enforced imperial law with a quiet, methodical efficiency. But their gaze often turned eastward, toward the rising sun, rather than westward where their brethren faltered. And so, a curious transformation unfolded, a duality within an empire that was supposed to be one. The Eastern Roman Empire thrived, even flourished, adapting to a world reshaped by migration, commerce, and faith. Its cities remained vibrant, its armies well-led, its economy resilient. The Western Roman Empire, by contrast, staggered beneath the weight of invasions, internal strife, and a faltering economy. What had been one body became two, and though they spoke the same imperial tongue, their hearts beat to different rhythms. In the gentle shadows of Constantinople's colonnades, one could almost forget the turmoil that gripped the western provinces. Here, life continued with a semblance of order. The streets bustled with merchants, scholars debated theology in shaded courtyards, and the sea breeze carried the scent of distant lands. Yet even in this apparent peace, the East was not immune to the tremors shaking the Roman world. Refugees from the West arrived at its gates, nobles seeking asylum, soldiers seeking employment, merchants seeking new markets. They brought stories of collapse, of cities in ruin, of emperors betrayed by their own men. These whispers stirred unease beneath the polished veneer of Eastern confidence. The lesson was simple and profound. The fate of the West could in time become the fate of the East. For now, Constantinople stood firm, a jewel upon the edge of Europe, its walls unbreached, its streets alive. But the twin truths hung in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. Rome was no longer one, and no empire, however glorious, could remain untouched by the currents of a changing world. As you drift now into the soft arms of sleep, let your thoughts linger upon the marble streets of Constantinople, washed in the golden light of a setting sun. Imagine the silent halls where emperors pondered the fate of a divided realm, the murmured prayers in its candlelit churches, the quiet lapping of the sea against its walls. The city shone, a beacon of endurance, but even the brightest light casts a shadow. And in those shadows lay the delicate threads of destiny, waiting, as always, for the gentle tug of time. Tomorrow will bring us westward again, to lands where the storm clouds gather thicker, where the heart of the Roman West beats faintly amid ruin and betrayal. But tonight, let the vision of Constantinople linger, a serene chapter in a story slowly turning toward its inexorable end. In this 13th part of our wandering tale, we return once more to the western half of the empire, where the twilight deepened with a gentle yet undeniable certainty. The Western Roman Empire, its fields, its cities, its legions, had begun to exhale a long, slow breath of surrender. And yet, amid the creeping shadows, it was not merely barbarians at the gates, nor treacherous generals that gnawed at its heart. The decay came from something subtler, quieter, a soft unravelling of the economy, the lifeblood that once nourished the vast machine of empire. For centuries, the Roman economy had thrived upon the silent, steady movement of coin, grain, and goods. The roads stretched like veins from Britannia's coast to the deserts of Egypt. Along them moved soldiers, traders, and taxis. The Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum, our sea, bore ships heavy with oil, wine, and wheat, their sails swelling in the soft western breeze. Cities rose as centres of commerce, their markets bustling, their workshops alive with the hum of craftsmen and merchants. But now, in the fading years, the pulse of trade began to falter. It started, as so many great shifts do, with the softest of whispers. Pirate raids upon merchant vessels became more frequent, emboldened by the thinning of Roman naval patrols. The grain fleets from Africa and Egypt, once the great providers of Rome's bread, arrived less reliably. Their delays meant hunger in the cities, rising prices, and unrest among a people accustomed to the steady hand of the annona, the grain dole that had fed countless generations. The emperors, desperate to maintain order, turned to measures born not of wisdom but of necessity. They debased the currency, adding more base metal to silver and gold coins, hoping to stretch dwindling resources. For a time, this artifice seemed a clever reprieve. But coinage, like trust, cannot be stretched forever without consequence. As the silver content diminished, so too did faith in the currency. Prices soared. Barter returned in places where once the denarius reigned supreme. The slow, invisible erosion of economic stability crept like ivy across the marble pillars of Roman life. Taxation, too, grew into a silent predator upon the lives of the common people. The state, ravenous for revenue to pay soldiers, buy off barbarians, and fund the endless machinery of government, demanded more from its citizens. In the countryside, small farmers found themselves strangled by levies they could not meet. Their options grew cruelly simple: sink into debt, flee their lands, or sell themselves into the patronage of powerful landowners. Thus began the quiet yet monumental rise of the latifundia, vast estates owned by the wealthy, worked by peasants bound by necessity if not by formal chains. The countryside, once a patchwork of independent holdings and proud Roman yeomanry, transformed into broad estates where the distinction between free man and serf blurred beneath the weight of economic despair. The proud Roman citizen farmer, backbone of the Republic and the early empire, faded into memory. In his place stood the colonist, tethered to the land, toiling not for himself, but for a master whose wealth bought protection from imperial demands. Urban centres fared little better. The great cities of the West, once vibrant hubs of trade, culture and civic life, began to wither. Craftsmen left their stalls as commerce dwindled. Public works, once the pride of emperors seeking glory in stone and marble, fell into disrepair. The baths grew cold, the forums stood quieter. Even the once bustling amphitheatres echoed hollowly, their spectacles fading as funds and fervour alike drained away. Rome herself, the eternal city, felt the weight of this gentle collapse. The city that had once been the centre of the world became a shadow of her former glory. Her palaces remained, her churches multiplied, but the pulse of wealth that had made her streets teem with life grew faint. The emperors no longer resided within her walls, preferring safer, more defensible cities like Ravenna or Milan. And without the emperor's presence, the golden river of imperial patronage dried to a trickle. In these quiet declines, a new power began to stir within the heart of urban life, the church. As civil institutions faltered, the bishoprics rose. Bishops became not only spiritual leaders, but civic protectors, arbitrators of disputes, and guardians of the poor. In basilicas lit by flickering oil lamps, amid the low hum of evening prayers, they gathered influence once wielded by senators and governors. The faithful flocked to them, seeking solace not merely for their souls, but for their livelihoods. And with this rise of ecclesiastical power came another quiet shift: the economy of piety. Donations to the church, land bequests from noble families, and the charitable redistribution of wealth created a new flow of resources, one less tied to imperial decrees and more to the whisper of spiritual salvation. This was no sudden usurpation, but a slow, natural redirection of trust from a fading state to a rising sanctuary. The barbarians, watching from beyond the frontiers, understood little of economic theory, yet instinctively sensed the weakening of Rome's sinews. They saw cities withering, soldiers paid in worthless coin, trade routes fallen silent. They pushed, gently at first, testing the edges where the empire's economic strength had grown brittle. And when resistance wavered, they pushed harder. Yet it was not merely external pressure that frayed the fabric of Roman commerce. The empire itself, stretched thin by civil wars, diverted resources away from prosperity and into the maw of conflict. The constant churn of internal strife, usurpers, pretenders, generals grasping for the purple, bled the treasury dry. Each conflict meant armies raised, cities sacked, provinces ravaged. Commerce cannot thrive amid the smoke of burning fields. Through all of this, the common people, those silent souls who tilled the earth, crafted goods, carried wares across the empire, endured. They did not rise in rebellion nor cast down emperors. They lived as people do through the slow erosion of their world, adapting with quiet resilience. But even the hardiest vine withers when the root is starved, and the Roman economy, once the lifeblood of an empire, grew increasingly starved of trust, wealth, and hope. As you let your mind settle upon these images, picture the quiet markets of a fading Roman town. A stall where the goods are fewer, a craftsman folding away his tools as customers dwindle, a farmer haggling over grain he can barely afford to part with. Imagine the slow decay of marble facades, the creeping vines overtaking once proud walls, the flickering lamplight of a basilica where prayers replace commerce. This was not a collapse that roared, it was one that whispered. The economy of Rome did not fall with a single strike but faded, like the last notes of a song drifting into silence. And in that silence a question lingered, soft as a sigh. Could an empire survive when its heart no longer pulsed with the commerce of trust and trade? Let this thought accompany you into rest, a gentle pondering of the unseen forces that shape the fates of empires and men alike. Tomorrow we will look toward the migrations, those great tides of people stirred by necessity and hope that washed against the fading shores of the Western Empire. But tonight, rest with the quiet echo of coin upon a merchant's table, the last remnant of a world slipping softly into shadow. As our journey draws us gently into the 14th part of this long twilight tale, we turn our thoughts toward the restless tides that lapped ceaselessly at the edges of the Roman world, the great migrations of peoples whose slow, relentless movements would transform the Western Empire in ways subtle and profound. These were not the thundering invasions sung of in later legends, not yet the cataclysmic sackings or heroic defenses. They were, in their beginning, currents stirred by necessity, by fear, and by the eternal human longing for land, safety, and hope. The world beyond the Roman frontiers was never empty. It hummed with life, tribes and clans, kingdoms and wandering bands, all moving, settling, trading, and sometimes fighting. For centuries, the might of Rome had held these shifting tides at bay. Its legions patrolled the rivers, its watchtowers lit fires upon the hills, and its emissaries forged treaties with chieftains and kings. The barbarian world was both threat and partner, feared and welcomed, fought and embraced. Yet, beneath this uneasy balance lay a reality Rome could not fully control. The world beyond its borders was changing. To the east, upon the endless steppes, a new and terrible force stirred the Huns. Fierce riders from lands barely known to Roman scribes, they swept westward like a storm, their swift horses carrying them across rivers and plains with a speed and ferocity unknown to the settled peoples of Europe. Their arrival sent ripples through the delicate web of tribal territories. The Gothic peoples, long neighbours of Rome, felt the chill of this storm first. The Goths, Visigoths in the west, Ostrogoths in the east, had dwelt along the Danube's banks for generations. They traded with Roman merchants, served in Roman armies, and even adopted elements of Roman culture. But the arrival of the Huns shattered their fragile security. Faced with annihilation or flight, the Gothic tribes turned their gaze southward, toward the broad, fertile lands of the Roman Empire. It was not conquest they sought, at least not at first. It was refuge. In the year 376, a vast host of Visigoths approached the Danube frontier, their leaders humbling themselves before the Roman governors, seeking permission to cross into imperial lands. They offered loyalty, service, and peace in exchange for settlement within the empire's embrace. The emperor at the time, Valens, wary but pragmatic, agreed. The Goths were allowed to cross, their families and wagons stretching in long, winding columns across the river's breadth. But the empire, strained by corruption and greed, betrayed its own promise. Roman officials extorted the desperate refugees, selling them rotten food at extortionate prices, demanding bribes for simple necessities. Hunger gnawed at the Goths, resentment festered. The fragile bond of trust snapped and rebellion flared. At Adrianople in 378, the Gothic host met the legions of Emperor Valens in battle. The outcome was a catastrophe for Rome. The emperor himself fell upon the field, his army crushed beneath the fury of a people who had once sought nothing more than a place to live. It was a turning point, not merely in military terms, but in the deeper fabric of Roman security. For the first time in living memory, a Roman emperor had fallen in battle against barbarian foes within the borders of the empire. Yet the Goths did not march on Rome. They sought lands, security, and a future for their people. And so began a new chapter in the story of migration, not as mere invasions, but as settlements, alliances, uneasy cohabitations. The Visigoths roamed the Balkans, sometimes pillaging, sometimes serving Roman interests, always a reminder that the old lines of loyalty and enmity had blurred. In their wake came others, the Vandals, the Alans, the Suebi, all stirred by pressures beyond their own lands, pushed by hunger, conflict, and the slow collapse of old tribal structures. They moved in great, wandering masses, families, warriors, elders, seeking what Rome had once seemed to promise: land, protection, a place in the sun. The empire, weary from within, could no longer muster the strength to repel or absorb these waves. Where once Roman governors would have summoned legions to guard the frontiers, now they bargained, bribed, or resigned themselves to coexistence. Some tribes were granted federate status, settled in provinces as allies of Rome, though their loyalty wavered with the seasons. Others moved deeper, crossing the frontiers almost unnoticed, setting roots in lands Rome could scarcely defend. In Gaul, the once proud Roman provinces saw the slow encroachment of Frankish and Burgundian tribes. In Hispania, the Vandals and Suebi carved out their own kingdoms amid the Roman ruins. In North Africa, the Vandals, once mere wanderers, would soon cross the seas to claim an empire of their own. Each movement, each settlement, each quiet migration frayed the tapestry of Roman unity further. Yet it is vital to understand that these were not faceless hordes nor savage invaders seeking destruction for its own sake. They were peoples with their own hopes, fears, and desires. They sought land to till, homes to build, and a future for their children. The tragedy lay not in their coming, but in the empire's inability to adapt, to integrate, to extend the bonds of citizenship and law that had once turned enemies into Romans. The migrations brought not only warriors, but craftsmen, farmers, and families. They brought new cultures, new traditions, new blends of language and belief. In this great movement of peoples, Europe itself began to transform, from a world of imperial provinces into a patchwork of emerging kingdoms and cultures. The seeds of the medieval world were sown amid the slow, soft retreat of Roman authority. As you picture now the slow march of a Gothic wagon train beneath a grey sky, or a Vandal family setting up camp on the fringes of a Roman villa, let your thoughts dwell not on conquest, but on the quiet persistence of life amid change. The migrations were not a storm that broke the empire in a single night, but a steady tide that reshaped its shores over generations. The Roman world did not fall with a single blow. It yielded, it adapted, it merged and changed. The migrations, like all great movements of history, were neither wholly dark nor wholly light. They were human, in all their complexity and quiet inevitability. Let this thought ease you gently toward rest, the vision of wandering peoples under the soft glow of dawn, of ancient Roman roads carrying not legions but families in search of hope. Tomorrow, we shall turn our gaze toward the men who sought to wield power amid this shifting world. Emperors, generals, and kings who rose and fell in the shadow of an empire slowly fading into history. But tonight, rest with the soft footfalls of a migrating world, their journey a quiet echo beneath the vast star-lit sky. Now, as we slip quietly into the 15th part of our unfolding tale, we find ourselves standing amidst a world of men who sought, in vain or in valor, to steer the vast and weary vessel of the Western Roman Empire through its slow descent into dusk. These were emperors, generals, and kings, not the titans of earlier ages whose names rang out in triumph across marble forums, but men born into a world already softened by uncertainty, their reigns shaped as much by necessity as by ambition. The imperial purple, once a symbol of near-divine authority, had become a garment worn with trepidation, a mantle placed upon the shoulders of those who often had little choice but to accept its burdens. In earlier centuries, to be emperor was to command armies, to hold the fate of nations in one's hands. Now it was often to serve as a figurehead, a pawn in the games of ambitious generals or powerful court factions. Let us first speak of Honorius, a man who, by the strange twist of fate, found himself emperor of the Western Roman Empire at the tender age of 10. His father, Theodosius the Great, last ruler of a unified Roman Empire, had divided his realm between his two sons upon his death. Arcadius would take the east, ruling from Constantinople. Honorius would hold the west, ruling from Milan, and later from the marshy refuge of Ravenna. It was a division not merely of land, but of strength and vision. Honorius was no soldier, no statesman. Timid, cautious, and perhaps ill-prepared for the mantle thrust upon him, he became a symbol of the weakened imperial authority in the West. His reign, stretching for nearly 3 decades, was marked not by his actions but by those of the men who ruled in his name. chief among them the formidable General Stilicho. Stilicho, half Roman and half Vandal by birth, embodied the strange fusion of cultures that now defined the empire. As Magister Militum, he served as the empire's strong arm, fighting to hold the West together against external threats and internal dissent. His skill on the battlefield earned him respect, but his foreign heritage earned him suspicion. His efforts delayed the inevitable for a time, pushing back Gothic advances, manoeuvring through a web of political intrigue, and balancing the fragile alliance between Rome and its federate tribes. But even Stilicho could not stand forever against the tide. Court conspiracies whispered fears, and the jealous ambitions of rivals led to his downfall. In 408, accused of treachery, Stilicho was executed, by imperial decree, by the very emperor he had served with unyielding loyalty. His death sent ripples of fear through the military ranks, especially among the barbarian federates who had served under him. Many deserted, turning from allies to enemies in the span of a season. And so came the Visigothic king, Alaric. Alaric, once a Roman general himself, a federate leader within the empire's ranks, now turned his gaze upon Italy. Driven by a mixture of frustration, ambition, and perhaps a sense of betrayal, he led his Gothic warriors across the Italian plains. Rome, ancient, proud, and seemingly eternal, trembled at his approach. For the first time in 800 years, a foreign army stood at its gates. In 410, after prolonged siege and fruitless negotiations, the unimaginable happened. The city of Rome fell. Alaric's Goths entered the Eternal City, not in a savage blaze of destruction, but with the slow, methodical inevitability of a people claiming what they had been long denied. Churches were spared, many citizens left unharmed. Yet the symbolism of the sack, the first since the Gauls centuries before, sent a chill across the known world. If Rome itself could fall, what hope remained for the empire? But Alaric, like so many of the so-called barbarian leaders, sought not the ruin of Rome but a place within its world. His death, shortly after the sack, his body said to be buried beneath a diverted river's bed, marked the end of his brief but seismic chapter. The Goths moved on, seeking new lands, settling eventually in Gaul and Hispania, weaving themselves into the tapestry of post-imperial Europe. In the wake of these events, a parade of emperors rose and fell, names flickering briefly before being extinguished in the turbulent winds of the era. Some were puppets raised by generals, others were figureheads installed by barbarian kings. Few held real power. The imperial throne of the West became less a seat of command and more a ceremonial relic, a symbol carried forward by inertia rather than by force. One such figure was Valentinian III, a boy emperor whose reign was dominated by the towering presence of Flavius Aetius, the last great Roman general of the West. Aetius, known as the last of the Romans, stood like a solitary pillar amid the ruins of imperial authority. His career was marked by endless conflict, against rivals within the court, against rebellious federates, against the growing power of the Huns under their fearsome king, Attila. It was Aetius who orchestrated the fragile alliances that turned back Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, a victory that echoed with the last martial triumph of Roman arms in the West. Yet even Aetius, the empire's defender, met his end not on the battlefield, but by the emperor's own hand. In a court rife with paranoia, Valentinian III slew his greatest general with his own sword, a final fatal blow to the Western imperial dream. Within a year, Valentinian himself fell to an assassin's blade. The wheel turned on, each revolution grinding the empire further into dust. Emperors came and went, Petronius Maximus, Avitus, Majorian, Severus, all fleeting, all powerless against the currents of disintegration. Some tried with desperate energy to reform, to rally the armies, to reclaim the provinces. Most failed before they had even begun. The final whisper of Western imperial authority would come in the person of Romulus Augustulus, a boy crowned emperor in 475, a mere shadow of a shadow. His reign lasted scarcely a year before the Germanic general Odoacer, a man raised in Roman service yet born beyond its frontiers, deposed him without fanfare. No great battle, no grand declaration. The empire in the West simply ended, as a candle flickers out at the close of a long and restless night. Romulus Augustulus vanished into quiet obscurity. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, signalling that the age of Western emperors had ended. not in a blaze of glory, but in a soft, resigned breath of history. As you let these names and moments settle upon your thoughts, picture them not as mere footnotes in dusty annals, but as human figures, flawed, frightened, ambitious, grasping at the fading light of a world slipping gently into shadow. They were men caught in the slow collapse of a civilization, each hoping, in vain, to hold back the tide with their own hands. Tonight, let your mind drift with the echoes of these final emperors, with the soft footfalls of generals walking deserted marble halls, with the faint cry of a herald announcing a name soon to be forgotten. Tomorrow, we shall look beyond the throne and sword, to the heart of faith that rose quietly amid the empire's decline, the church and the silent empire it built among ruins. But for now, rest with the gentle knowledge that even in their fall, these men shaped the quiet twilight of an age. Now in this 16th passage of our lingering story, we shift our gaze from the palaces of emperors and the banners of generals to a quieter realm. A realm where stone basilicas replaced marble temples, where prayers whispered in candlelit chapels echoed louder in the hearts of men than the proclamations of fading emperors. As the Roman state weakened, as legions faltered and frontiers unraveled, a different kind of empire stirred within the shadows of the old world, the empire of the church. For centuries, Christianity had walked a precarious path within the Roman Empire. Born in the humble streets of Judea, nurtured in whispered gatherings, it spread quietly among slaves, merchants, and soldiers. It endured persecution, sometimes fierce, sometimes passing, always testing the faith of its adherents. Yet in the great arc of history, persecution sharpened rather than silenced it. The more the empire sought to suppress the faith, the more deeply it took root, entwining itself within the fabric of Roman life. When Constantine the Great embraced Christianity, the world shifted in ways subtle and profound. The Edict of Milan in 313 granted the faith legitimacy, allowing churches to rise not in secret but in the open air of the cities. The faith of martyrs became the faith of emperors. Councils convened under imperial auspices, Nicaea, Chalcedon, shaped doctrine, guided practice, and wove the teachings of Christ into the legal and moral codes of the empire. The church grew, not only in numbers but in authority, its bishops and patriarchs seated alongside senators and generals in the councils of power. Yet in the West, as the Roman state weakened, the church's role expanded beyond spiritual guidance. It became the steward of a crumbling world. Where once the empire had been the guardian of order, it now fell to the church to protect, to administer, to shelter. Bishops took on roles once reserved for governors. In times of invasion or famine, it was the local bishop who negotiated with barbarian chiefs, who distributed food to the starving, who maintained some semblance of justice when civil courts fell silent. They became shepherds in the broadest sense, not only of souls, but of the fragile communities that clustered around the embers of Roman civilization. Nowhere was this more visible than in the city of Rome itself. As imperial authority waned and emperors fled to Ravenna or were replaced by foreign kings, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, stood increasingly alone as the guardian of the ancient city. He was no king, nor sought to be. Yet in his hands rested a quiet power drawn not from legions or treasure, but from faith and trust. When Alaric's Goths approached Rome, it was Pope Innocent I who pleaded for mercy. When Attila the Hun marched upon Italy, it was Pope Leo I who rode out to meet him, bearing no sword, only words, and turned him away. These acts, half-shrouded in the mists of legend, reflected a deeper truth. The moral authority of the Church began to eclipse the fading shadow of the empire. The Church's influence was not confined to the high offices of bishops and popes. Monasteries, humble, quiet places of prayer and labour, sprang up across the landscape. From the windswept coasts of Britannia to the sunlit hills of Italy, monks gathered in simple communities, devoting their lives to contemplation, study and service. They tilled the soil, copied manuscripts, taught the young, and offered refuge to the weary. In a world fraying at the edges, monasteries became islands of order and light. These communities preserved not only the sacred scriptures, but the wisdom of the ancient world, texts of philosophy, science and literature that might otherwise have been lost amid the ruins. Within the thick stone walls of monastic libraries, words of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero and Virgil slept in quiet ink upon parchment, waiting to awaken future generations. The monks themselves lived lives of simplicity and service. They followed rules, such as those of Benedict of Nursia, that called for humility, obedience, and communal labour. Their prayers marked the hours of the day, their hands worked the earth or the script. In their rhythm, they found peace, and in their work they preserved the memory of a civilization fading beyond their cloisters. The church did not rise without its own struggles. Doctrinal disputes flared, sometimes bitterly. Heresies arose, Arianism, Donatism, Pelagianism, and councils convened to settle matters of faith and practice. The authority of the Pope, especially in the West, grew slowly, challenged by rival bishops, questioned by emperors. Yet through these struggles, the Church emerged not as a monolith of unchallenged power, but as a resilient, adaptable force, a living institution shaped by faith, forged in adversity. As Roman authority crumbled, the Church offered a different kind of continuity. It spoke of a kingdom not of this world, of a peace beyond the reach of swords and thrones. Its message resonated deeply in a world hungry for stability, hope, and meaning. The crumbling walls of the empire gave way to the quiet, enduring strength of a spiritual community that transcended borders and time. Even the barbarians, those restless tribes who pressed upon the empire's frontiers, felt the pull of the church. Missionaries ventured into their lands, bringing with them not conquest, but the gospel. Over time, Gothic kings, Frankish chieftains, and even Vandal rulers converted, weaving the faith of Rome into the hearts of former foes. The sword could conquer cities, but faith conquered hearts. And so, amid the slow fading of imperial power, a new kind of empire emerged, not bound by legions or provinces, but by shared belief, by the quiet strength of communities bound in prayer and purpose. The Roman Empire of stone and sword gave way to the Christian empire of faith and word, a soft, enduring light that would carry fragments of the ancient world into the ages yet to come. As you drift into quiet rest, imagine the soft flicker of lamplight upon the walls of a monastery, the low chant of monks at evening prayer, the silent pen strokes of a scribe preserving the wisdom of the ancients. Picture a bishop standing before a frightened crowd, offering not the promise of armies, but the quiet strength of hope. These are the guardians of a world in transition, not warriors, but stewards of the spirit, holding the fragile line between the past and the dawn of a new age. Tomorrow we will turn our gaze to the shifting soul of Europe itself, to the lands and peoples beyond Rome's reach, who now stepped forward to shape a world no longer imperial but medieval. But for tonight, let your heart rest with the gentle rhythm of prayer, the soft turning of parchment, the enduring echo of faith, in a world slowly learning how to begin anew. In this 17th part of our unfolding story, we step softly into the shifting landscape of post-imperial Europe, a world emerging from the long shadow of Rome, shaped not by the decrees of emperors, but by the footsteps of new kings and the soft settling of peoples seeking home upon ancient soil. The fall of the Western Roman Empire did not mark the end of civilization, nor the death of culture. Rather, it signaled the slow, hesitant birth of something new, a world we would come to know as medieval. In the wake of Rome's quiet departure, the lands it once held did not fall into utter ruin. Instead, they shifted, adapted, transformed. Where imperial governors had once ruled with the seal of Caesar, now chieftains and kings rose from among the peoples who had crossed Rome's fading frontiers. These leaders, many of whom had once served as federate commanders under Roman banners, stepped into the spaces left by the departing legions, weaving their own authority upon the tapestry of Europe. The Visigoths, after their long wanderings and the sack of Rome, settled in the fertile lands of Gaul and later Hispania. Under their king, Euric, they established a kingdom that blended Roman legal traditions with Gothic customs. They adopted the Latin tongue for administration, respected the remnants of Roman law, and even embraced Christianity, though at first through the lens of Arianism, a belief deemed heretical by Roman orthodoxy. Their courts echoed with the voices of both Gothic warriors and Roman senators, an uneasy but enduring mingling of worlds. In Gaul's northern reaches, the Franks stirred, a people of Germanic stock, fierce and pragmatic. Unlike many of their neighbours, the Franks did not merely settle upon Roman lands, they grew within them. Their king, Clovis, would become a figure of singular importance, uniting the Frankish tribes and embracing Catholic Christianity. His baptism, celebrated in whispered awe within the stone walls of Reims Cathedral, marked a pivotal moment, the fusion of Frankish power with Roman faith. Under Clovis and his descendants, the seeds of what would become the Kingdom of France were sown, their roots entangled with both barbarian vigour and Roman legacy. Further east, in the lands of the old Roman province of Germania, the Alemanni, the Bavarians and other tribes carved out their own spaces. They formed loose confederations and petty kingdoms, their leaders often looking to Rome's memory for models of authority, even as they shaped a culture uniquely their own. The memory of Roman roads, Roman laws and Roman titles lingered like distant echoes in their halls. In Britannia, a different story unfolded. The legions had departed in the early 5th century, recalled to defend the heartlands of the empire. Left to their own devices, the Romanized Britons faced waves of new settlers from across the North Sea, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes. These Germanic peoples did not come merely as raiders, they came as settlers, carving out new kingdoms amid the green hills and misty moors. The Romano-British culture, once vibrant, retreated into the western reaches of the island, into Wales, Cornwall and the rugged north. There, legends of kings and warriors grew, their stories blending history and myth in the soft twilight of a land in transformation. In Italy, the heart of the old empire, the Ostrogoths arrived under the leadership of Theodoric the Great. A warrior raised at the court of Constantinople, Theodoric moved westward, not as a mere conqueror, but as a ruler seeking to restore order to a land adrift. His reign in Italy became a curious interlude. A Gothic king ruling as a Roman patrician, upholding Roman laws, patronizing Roman culture, and striving to balance the traditions of his Gothic followers with the heritage of the Italian peninsula. His court at Ravenna became a center of learning and art, a flickering echo of imperial grandeur amid the gathering dusk. Yet amid this tapestry of new powers, the old lines between Roman and barbarian blurred with quiet inevitability. Intermarriage softened ancient enmities. Laws written in Latin codified the rights of Gothic and Roman alike. Christian faith, though divided in doctrine, served as a bridge between cultures. The Latin language endured, evolving slowly in the mouths of peasants and priests, giving birth in time to the tongues we know today as French, Spanish, Italian. And so, a new Europe emerged, not born in a single moment, nor shaped by a single hand, but rising gently from the soil of a world where empire had become memory. The lands of the West no longer answered to a single emperor. Instead, they became a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities and tribal territories. Power became local, authority personal. Loyalty shifted from distant emperors to nearby lords, from Rome's vanished eagle to the banners of new kings. Yet in this fragmentation, there was not only loss, but resilience. Local communities, freed from the burdens of distant imperial demands, found new ways to govern themselves. Monasteries, churches and noble estates became centers of life, offering protection, justice and stability in a world of shifting tides. The collapse of empire did not destroy Europe. It reshaped it into something more intimate, more rooted in the land and its people. Trade routes adjusted, not vanished. Markets shrank, but endured. The great cities of antiquity faded in size, yet remained centers of faith and learning. The rhythms of life continued. Harvests gathered, festivals celebrated, children born and taught the stories of their land. The world did not end. It changed. As you rest now, imagine the quiet scenes of this changing world. A Gothic king in a Roman villa consulting with senators, a Frankish warrior bowing his head before a Catholic bishop, a monk in a distant Irish monastery, copying lines of Latin verse beneath the soft glow of candlelight. These were the unseen hands shaping the dawn of medieval Europe, not in the thunder of conquest, but in the quiet persistence of life. Tomorrow we shall turn to the eastern shores, where Constantinople stood as a silent witness to the West's transformation, an empire that endured, adapted, and watched as the world beyond its walls stepped cautiously into a new age. But tonight, let your thoughts rest with the soft murmur of this changing land, where kings and peasants alike took their first uncertain steps into a world without Rome. In this 18th part of our quiet unfolding, we drift eastward once again to where the marble walls of Constantinople stood, still gleaming, still vigilant, amid a world that watched the West's slow unraveling with a mixture of sorrow, detachment, and wary resolve. Here in the Eastern Roman Empire, the story of Rome did not end but transformed, taking on a shape both familiar and strange. A Roman Empire that survived, though altered by time, necessity, and the tides of history. The city itself remained a marvel, a shining jewel upon the Bosporus, its spires and domes rising beneath the soft veil of morning mist. The great walls, thick and proud, guarded against threats from both land and sea. Within, markets hummed with the murmur of traders from distant shores, processions wound through streets paved with ancient stones, and in the heart of the city, Hagia Sophia stood, a testament to the union of imperial authority and sacred devotion. Yet Constantinople was no mere heirloom of Rome's past. It became something different, a living, breathing embodiment of a Roman legacy reshaped by the East. Here Greek flowed more freely than Latin. Here the emperor ruled not only as a sovereign, but as a vicar of divine authority, his throne enshrined by the weight of centuries and the aura of heavenly favor. The Christian faith, so deeply entwined with imperial identity, suffused every aspect of governance, art, and daily life. The line between church and state blurred into a delicate weave of power and piety. Unlike the West, where the collapse of centralized authority birthed a patchwork of kingdoms, the Eastern Empire, Byzantium as later generations would call it, endured in singular form. Its armies, though tested, held firm against waves of invaders. Its administrators, inheritors of Roman law and Greek thought, maintained the machinery of government. Its merchants, sailing the waters of the Aegean and beyond, ensured the flow of wealth through its markets. Yet endurance did not mean invincibility. The Eastern Empire faced its own storms, Persian wars, religious controversies, revolts in the provinces. The Huns thundered at its borders, the Goths pressed its frontiers. The great schisms of faith, iconoclasm, disputes over doctrine, rocked the unity of church and empire alike. Even within its walls, the pulse of rebellion sometimes beat, as factions within Constantinople itself, blues and greens, more than mere chariot racing clubs, rose in riots that shook the very heart of imperial authority. And yet, amid these challenges, the Eastern Roman Empire displayed a curious resilience, a flexibility born not from the might of arms alone, but from a sophisticated dance of diplomacy, adaptation, and survival. The emperors learned to weave alliances as deftly as they wielded swords. They married daughters to barbarian kings, secured treaties with rising powers, and balanced religious factions with careful, if sometimes cynical, statecraft. One emperor in particular would rise from this shifting world to leave a mark both brilliant and haunting upon the pages of history, Justinian I. Ascending the throne in the early 6th century, Justinian dreamed not merely of preserving the empire, but of restoring its ancient glory. His vision was grand, a reunified Roman world, the laws of Rome codified and refined, the splendor of imperial authority renewed. With his formidable wife, Theodora, a woman of remarkable intelligence and will, by his side, Justinian embarked on an ambitious campaign of conquest, lawmaking, and architectural splendor. Under his command, the brilliant general Belisarius led armies westward, reclaiming territories in North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. For a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed as if the old Roman Empire might rise anew. Victories in battle, triumphs in courts, and the crowning achievement of Hagia Sophia's construction in Constantinople painted a portrait of revival. But even in success, shadows lingered. The wars of reconquest, though triumphant on the field, strained the empire's resources to the brink. The reconquered lands of Italy, once flourishing under Roman law, lay devastated by years of brutal conflict. Plagues swept through Constantinople, none more infamous than the Justinianic plague, which decimated the population, draining the lifeblood of labor, trade, and military strength. The dream of restoration flickered, burdened by the weight of its own ambition. And yet, Justinian's legacy endured in quieter, deeper ways. His codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, would outlast empires, shaping legal thought for centuries to come. His buildings, especially Hagia Sophia, stood as silent witnesses to the grandeur and faith of a civilization that refused to surrender to the darkness. His vision of a Christian empire, though imperfectly realized, set the stage for Byzantium's enduring role as a bridge between ancient Rome and the medieval world. Constantinople itself remained a heartbeat amid the shifting tides, a city that bore witness to the fall of the West, yet stood firm against its own trials. The Byzantines, as they would later be known, carried forward the flame of Roman civilization, not as mere echoes of the past, but as a living culture adapting to the demands of a changing world. They learned to coexist with rising powers, the Slavs to the north, the Persians to the east, the Arab caliphates that would soon surge across ancient Roman provinces. They fought, they traded, they negotiated, they endured. As you let your thoughts wander now, picture the great walls of Constantinople at dusk, their shadows stretching across the golden waters. Imagine the solemn chants rising from within Hagia Sophia's vast dome, mingling with the distant cries of merchants and the soft footsteps of soldiers upon the ramparts. The Eastern Roman Empire did not collapse as its Western counterpart had. Instead, it bent with the winds of change, swayed by storms, yet never broke. Tonight, let your mind rest with the quiet assurance that even in history's darkest hours, some lights flicker but do not fade. Byzantium, Rome in the East, remained a living memory of the ancient world, a silent witness to the fall of one empire and the birth of countless new worlds beyond its marble walls. Tomorrow, we will return to the lingering echoes of Rome's legacy in the West, to the ways its laws, languages and dreams continued to shape the emerging medieval age. But for now, sleep with the image of Constantinople shining like a steadfast lantern amid the long, unfolding night. The sun had long since dipped beneath the hills of Latium, casting the ancient lands of the former Roman heartlands into a deep and tranquil twilight. But in a small hamlet that clung to the remains of what had once been a bustling Roman outpost, old tales lingered like ivy along the crumbling stone walls. Among these whispered legacies, few were spoken of with such aching reverence as the twilight years of Rome herself. Those last, gasping decades where emperors were more shadows than sovereigns, and the empire's breath grew shallower with each turning season. In this night's tale, we find ourselves not in the palaces of power or among the dusty corridors of the Senate, but far from the imperial gaze, in the fractured provinces of Gaul, where the limes had once bristled with soldiers' steel, now thinned and weary from decades of conflict and neglect. Here, as the 5th century dawned, the echoes of Roman authority had become faint and hollow. The cities, once proud bastions of Roman order, now flickered like dying candles in a winter wind. In the countryside, old patrician villas lay in overgrown solitude, their columns weathered and chipped, their mosaics buried beneath creeping vines. Yet within these ruins, life still breathed, stubborn and quiet. Peasants, once citizens of the mighty empire, now tilled the land in uncertainty, unsure whether they laboured for Rome, for a barbarian king, or simply for the sustenance of their own kin. It was in such a village, pressed against the chill mists of the Loire, that a certain elder, by the name of Lucanus, lived, an aged Roman who had once served as a scribe under the local magistrate during the better years of the empire. Lucanus was the keeper of memories, and as the world seemed to crumble around him, he became a living vessel for what had been. The children of the village would sit wide-eyed around the hearth where he recounted tales of the old emperors, of the triumphal arches, of games held in honour of the gods, and of roads so smooth and vast they once tied the world together like threads in a golden tapestry. Yet Lucanus's stories grew darker with each passing year. He spoke now of things unravelling, of grain ships no longer arriving from Africa, of roads becoming impassable, and of legions that simply stopped coming. He spoke, too, of fear, the kind that curled through the soul in the dead of night, the fear that one day the village would awaken not to the songs of birds, but to the clang of foreign arms. These fears were not unfounded. Across Gaul, the Roman governors, now often little more than local warlords, struggled to collect taxes or maintain their dwindling militias. The roads were no longer safe for travellers, let alone traders. Brigands, some Roman deserters, others barbarian-born, roamed freely. Even in places where Rome's standards still flew, they were more talisman than guarantee, fluttering above crumbling walls with an air of desperate nostalgia. The barbarian federates, once allies paid to defend Roman borders, had grown bold and hungry. They no longer looked to Rome for orders, but for weaknesses. The Franks in the north, the Burgundians in the east, and the Visigoths in the south, Each began to carve out realms of their own, first in the name of alliance, and then in open defiance. Roman generals, some loyal, some merely ambitious, began to treat their commands as personal domains. They made bargains in backrooms, striking deals with tribal chieftains, and crowning puppet emperors who could scarcely govern the villas around their palaces, let alone an empire. It was during this fracturing that a young soldier named Marcus Gaius Severinus entered Lucanus's tale. Marcus was born in Aurelianum, now a city caught in the crosswinds of Roman decline and barbarian ambition. The son of a decurion who had once held a modest posting under the distant rule of Honorius, Marcus had grown up with the fading shadow of Rome cast long across his life. As a boy, he had watched the veterans train in dusty fields, polishing dented helms and reciting oaths to a Rome that already seemed half dead. His dreams were filled not with the glory of new conquests, but with the desperate hope that some piece of the old world might survive for him to live in. By the time he was of age to bear arms, the legions were gone from Aurelianum. What remained were scattered cohorts of militia, poorly equipped, often unpaid, but clinging to the symbols of Rome with stubborn pride. Marcus rose quickly among their ranks, not through brilliance of strategy, but through an unshakable steadiness. He carried himself as though the empire still stood unshaken, and in doing so, inspired others to pretend the same. His breastplate bore the fading SPQR with almost priestly reverence, and when he marched, it was to the rhythm of ancient orders, though no one remained to issue them. One spring, word reached Aurelianum that a Visigothic warband was moving northward, their path curving perilously close to the Loire. Panic stirred among the local lords. Messages were dispatched to what remained of Roman command in Gaul, but no reply came. The burden fell to men like Marcus, to those who still held Rome in their hearts, even if only in memory. With a ragged band of fewer than 200 men, Marcus marched southward to meet the threat, knowing full well he could not repel it. The gesture, however, was more than tactical. It was ceremonial, an offering to the dignity of a dying world. His march echoed the footsteps of centurions long buried, their bones now part of the soil. Lucanus remembered that spring well. He had stood beside the road as Marcus passed, and saw in the young man's eyes the strange mixture of fire and sorrow that marked those born too late to serve a living empire, and too early to belong to the new order that would rise from its ashes. Days passed, then weeks. Marcus never returned. Some said he perished in battle. Others whispered that he had struck a pact with the Visigothic leader and vanished into the hills. A few believed he still lived, wandering the frontier like a ghost, guarding the lost honor of Rome. Lucanus never speculated. Instead, he would gaze into the hearth and murmur softly, "In the end, it was not the fall of cities or the loss of battles that broke Rome. It was when men like Marcus, brave and true, vanished into the fog, and no one came to take their place." And so another stitch was undone in the great tapestry of empire, not with fire and ruin, but with the quiet absences of those who once believed. As the seasons wore on, the memory of Marcus faded into the soft murmur of the countryside, one name among many swallowed by the slow erosion of an empire's reach. In distant Ravenna, where emperors still clung to their thrones amid marble halls and shrinking retinues, such tales never reached imperial ears. The court existed now in a world apart, a shadow realm of fragile treaties, courtly intrigue, and ceaseless fear of the next rebellion or barbarian raid. But in the outlying provinces, the pulse of Rome beat ever fainter, like the last embers of a once roaring fire. In a quiet villa overlooking the vineyards of Aquitania, another story began to weave itself into the slow unraveling of empire, a story not of soldiers but of merchants and scribes, those invisible threads that once held the vast Roman world together through trade and word. Here lived Aurelia, a woman born to a family of modest senatorial rank, her lineage reaching back to senators of the late Republic, names that now echoed only faintly in forgotten decrees and fading family scrolls. Aurelia's life had been one of quiet stewardship. Her father, once a magistrate of the province, had passed on to her not riches or land. Those had been steadily stripped away by the relentless taxation and predations of soldiers, but a love of letters and the art of record-keeping. She became, in her own right, a guardian of memory, meticulously preserving contracts, wills, trade agreements, and family histories in a world where written word had begun to lose its weight. But even this role grew perilous in an age when the ink of imperial authority no longer held power beyond the reach of a local warlord's sword. Aurelia watched as the merchants who once brought their wares from Carthage or Alexandria stopped arriving at her villa's gates. The roads, infested with brigands and patrolled by unscrupulous mercenaries, became too dangerous to traverse. Grain shipments faltered, and with them, the steady rhythm of commerce that had nourished not just markets, but the Roman way of life itself. It was during the quiet desolation of one such autumn that a merchant named Decimus arrived at Aurelia's estate. A man of middle years, his cloak worn thin, his face lined by years of roads travelled and deals struck in distant lands. He came not with goods, but with news, a rare commodity more precious than coin. Decimus spoke of the ports of Narbo and Massilia, once vibrant with the bustle of Mediterranean trade, now hushed beneath the looming shadows of Visigothic ships. The sea lanes, once secured by Roman fleets, now bristled with pirates and foreign warbands. Rome's once proud merchant fleets had either been commandeered by local lords or scuttled by enemy hands. Markets, he said, now functioned at the whim of barbarian chieftains who taxed traders in kind or in blood. Yet it was not merely the loss of trade that carried the weight of doom in his words. Decimus, in hushed tones, spoke of the silent exodus of Rome's administrative class, the scribes, notaries, and clerks who had kept the great machinery of law and commerce moving. As cities fell or broke away, these men and women slipped quietly into obscurity or fled into the countryside. Some swore allegiance to new rulers, barbarian kings eager to learn the ways of Roman governance, but most simply vanished, swallowed by the rising tide of chaos. Aurelia listened, her heart aching with a sorrow too vast for words. In Decimus's account she saw mirrored her own quiet struggle, a battle not fought with swords, but with ink and parchment, against an enemy far more insidious than invaders, the creeping oblivion of forgetting. As trade died, so too did the records, the archives, the memories of contracts that bound men together in trust. Without these, law became mere whim, and civilization unmoored itself from its ancient anchors. Yet even in this despair, Decimus's tale stirred within her a quiet resolve. For there was a strange and stubborn beauty in the remnants of Rome, an echo of something eternal, waiting in the ruins and in the hearts of those who still remembered. As long as there were hands willing to write, there remained a fragile thread connecting the present to a greater past. In the weeks that followed, Aurelia invited Decimus to remain at her estate. Together they began the painstaking work of copying and preserving what records they could find, old laws, trade agreements, family genealogies. They sent quiet word to neighbouring estates, inviting scribes and scholars to join them. Few came, but those who did brought with them fragments of Rome's memory, piecing together a tapestry frayed and worn, yet still breathing with the echoes of its former grandeur. Their efforts, humble and unnoticed by the great world beyond, became a beacon in a darkening age. Travellers passing through spoke of the villa of the Lady Aurelia, a place where Roman law was still copied, where Latin still flowed like a living river, and where the ghost of the empire whispered in the scratch of a scribe's pen. But time, ever the silent conqueror, marched on. The world around them continued to fracture. Barbarian warbands swept across the provinces with increasing boldness. Roman generals in Gaul declared themselves kings, donning crowns where once they had worn laurels. The imperial court in Ravenna, distant and beleaguered, sent envoys and edicts that arrived too late, if they arrived at all. And yet amidst the decay the villa stood, a silent testament not to Rome's power, but to its spirit. The flame flickered, but did not extinguish. One evening, as the sun bled its last light over the western hills, Aurelia sat upon the villa's terrace, gazing out over the land that had been Rome's heart. Decimus stood beside her, silent in reverent thought. Between them lay a scroll, an old copy of the Lex Julia, its ink faded, its edges worn. In that moment they understood. Rome had never been merely walls and armies, emperors and edicts. It was a dream, a shared belief in order, in law, in the binding power of memory. And as long as that dream lingered, whispered from heart to heart, the fall of empires could never truly erase it. They shared no words, for none were needed. The soft rustle of parchment in the evening breeze spoke enough, a song of a world slipping into shadow, yet refusing to be forgotten. The winter that followed settled upon the land with a quiet, relentless grip. Frost veiled the fields of Aquitania, and the winding roads that once bore the steady tramp of Roman merchants now lay silent beneath a blanket of pale mist. The villa of Lady Aurelia stood like a lone sentinel upon the edge of memory, a place where words and laws were still cherished, though the world beyond had grown indifferent to both. In those months of dimmed light and brittle air, visitors came less frequently. Those who did arrive came not as scholars or scribes, but as wanderers, dispossessed nobles, fleeing soldiers, and weary peasants seeking refuge from the tides of violence that swelled along the frontiers. Aurelia, with a heart both wise and weary, opened her gates to them all. Though her granaries thinned, she offered shelter without demand for oath or allegiance. In her quiet heart she held fast to a fading conviction that even amidst the ruin of order, mercy must remain. Among these refugees came a man unlike the others. He arrived at dusk, clad in a weather-beaten cloak, his face shadowed beneath a worn hood. His horse bore the scars of a hard journey, its flanks lathered with sweat. The guards at the villa's gate hesitated, sensing a presence marked by something neither noble nor common. Yet before they could challenge him, he dismounted and quietly surrendered his sword, a simple gesture that spoke volumes in an age when few yielded their arms without coercion. Aurelia received him in the hall where once Roman magistrates had sat in judgment, beneath fading frescoes that still whispered of a grander time. The man gave his name as Flavius Marcellinus, a former officer of the Western legions, though the legions themselves now existed more in memory than in might. His eyes, dark and watchful, bore the look of a man who had seen empires fall and friends perish with equal inevitability. Marcellinus did not come seeking refuge alone. He carried with him a small chest, bound in iron and marked with the imperial sigil, a chest he placed gently upon the stone floor before Aurelia. With a voice low and steady, he explained that its contents were among the last official records of the Western legions in Gaul. Orders, dispatches, lists of garrisons now dissolved or destroyed. It was, in its way, a coffin of an army's soul. Aurelia listened in stillness. She knew, with a certainty that settled upon her like the weight of snow upon bare branches, that this chest contained more than mere ink on parchment. It bore witness to a vanished order, the final echoes of legions that had once stood astride the known world. Over the nights that followed, Marcellinus remained at the villa, taking his meals in silence, offering no tales of his journey, nor asking questions of others. Yet in quiet moments by the hearth, he sat beside Aurelia and Decimus, as they pored over the brittle documents, helping them piece together the scattered fragments of a world now fractured beyond repair. From these pages unfolded a portrait of slow erosion, garrisons ordered to hold impossible positions with dwindling men, supply chains severed by raids and mutiny, commanders pleading for reinforcements that never came. Names of men lost to the cold ink of forgotten scrolls surfaced, legates, tribunes, centurions, all swept away like leaves before a storm. But beyond the chronicles of defeat lay something more haunting. The realization that even as the Western legions disintegrated, they had fought not merely against barbarian hordes, but against abandonment itself. The court in Ravenna, too distant and besieged by its own decay, had grown deaf to their pleas. Rome, the eternal city, had become a ghostly master, issuing commands no longer rooted in power, but in memory and fear. One night, as a chill wind rattled the shutters of the villa, Marcellinus spoke at last of his own story. He had been a tribune stationed near Lugdunum, once a proud city of the empire, now little more than a fortress clinging to old allegiances. His unit had received orders to defend a mountain pass against an approaching horde of Alemanni. With fewer than 200 men, they had held the pass for 3 brutal days. When relief failed to arrive, they were slaughtered almost to the last. Marcellinus, wounded and delirious, had been spared by the enemy, a mercy granted by a chieftain who admired his stubbornness. He spoke not with bitterness, but with a quiet resignation, a man who had outlived the world that had shaped him. His survival, he confessed, felt less like fortune and more like a strange exile from a vanished age. Aurelia, hearing his tale, felt within her a deep and aching kinship. They were, in their own ways, relics, keepers of a flame whose warmth no longer reached the world's heart. Yet in this shared mourning arose a fragile sense of purpose. Together with Decimus, they vowed to continue their quiet work, preserving not just laws and names, but the memory of those who had fought, fallen, or simply faded away beneath the indifferent gaze of history. Through the long winter, their efforts became a quiet ritual. By day, they copied documents by the pale light of a sun that seldom broke through the clouds. By night, they spoke softly of the world that had been, of cities glittering beneath Roman standards, of scholars debating in marble forums, of legions marching in disciplined ranks across distant frontiers. These were not mere recollections, but invocations, a fragile defiance against the encroaching dark. And outside the villa's walls, the world moved ever closer to the edge. Rumours whispered of a new Visigothic campaign moving westward, swallowing lands and cities with a hunger that nothing seemed to sate. In Ravenna, the emperor himself, by then little more than a puppet, clung to power amid the shifting sands of courtly betrayal. Across the Alps, rumours told of a boy king rising among the barbarian tribes, dreaming not merely of conquest, but of a new order to be forged upon the ruins of the old. But within the stone halls of Aurelia's villa, a small defiant heartbeat endured. No legions guarded its gates, no emperor sanctioned its work. Yet here, among the scrolls and the whispers of the past, the memory of Rome lingered, an ember refusing to die. For in every word copied, in every tale remembered, there lay a soft and steady hope, that though the empire might fall, the spirit it had kindled would endure, carried forward by those who refused to forget. The final spring dawned upon Aquitania with a hush so profound it seemed the world itself was holding its breath. The villa, perched amid the soft undulations of vineyards and pale olive groves, basked in a frail sunlight that warmed neither heart nor stone. Yet within its worn walls, life stirred with a quiet purpose, the kind born not of hope for triumph, but of a steadfast refusal to surrender memory to the creeping void. Aurelia, now marked by seasons of quiet resistance, rose each morning before the mist lifted from the hills. With careful hands, she unfurled scrolls and codices, the ink upon them dark against vellum aged by decades. Decimus worked beside her, his once bold merchant's hands grown delicate with the art of preservation. Marcellinus, his weathered frame still bearing the straightness of a soldier, gathered parchments rescued from abandoned villas and half-ruined estates, bringing them in quiet offerings to their growing archive. The villa had become a sanctum of remembrance, neither fortress nor monastery, but something rarer still, a hearth for a dying civilization's last whispered words. They were but a handful against the tide, scribes and seekers in a world swiftly turning its gaze from scrolls and laws to swords and thrones. Yet on a pale morning in March, a shadow darker than any before fell upon their doorstep. The rider arrived at a gallop, his horse lathered in sweat, its flanks trembling from a journey pushed beyond endurance. He bore no standard, wore no crest of allegiance. Yet the urgency in his eyes spoke of more than personal peril. His voice, when he spoke, was raw with fear and dust. "The Visigoths," he gasped. "They come from the south. Armies, entire cities swallowed. They move faster than the wind, faster than word can flee. They're weeks away, maybe days." A hush fell upon the villa. The scribes laid down their pens. Decimus, setting aside his scroll, met Aurelia's gaze, steady, questioning. Marcellinus said nothing. He merely placed a hand upon the hilt of his sword, the reflex of a man who had long ceased to expect rescue. There were choices, they all knew. Choices simple and brutal in their clarity. They could flee, scatter to the hills, vanish into the forest beyond the Loire where many had sought refuge before. They could attempt to bargain, to throw themselves upon the mercy of those who might not understand nor care for Rome's fragile legacy. Or they could stay. The answer came not in a council of war, nor in a heated debate, but in the quiet way each returned to their work that morning. Pens lifted, ink touched parchment, and the soft scratching of quills resumed its slow chorus. If the storm was to fall upon them, they would meet it as they had met the decay of their world, with ink, with memory, with a grace the sword could not command. Days passed. The sky grew heavy with the scent of impending summer, though warmth did not return. Travellers, merchants, peasants, wandering soldiers, flowed northward in frightened droves. They spoke of cities emptied in a night, of Roman banners trampled beneath Visigothic boots, of leaders either fled or butchered. The name of the Visigothic king, Uric, grew in whispered dread, a shadow larger than any single man should cast. Aurelia listened to them all. She offered food to the hungry, rest to the weary. But her heart remained anchored within the villa, within the fragile fortress of words and memory they had built. Marcellinus prepared as a soldier might, fortifying gates, instructing the few men who had gathered under their shelter, not with the illusion of victory, but with the dignity of resistance. Decimus arranged the archives, sealing them within the deepest chambers of the villa. Scrolls and codices bound in leather, placed within chests marked with the seal of Rome, not the seal of emperors, but the eternal mark of a civilization's soul. On the eve before the expected storm, they gathered beneath the ancient oak that stood before the villa's entrance. The sun bled its last over the horizon, casting the land in a deep, quiet glow. They did not speak of war or fate. They spoke instead of roads that once stretched to the world's ends, of libraries whose marble halls echoed with the voices of philosophers, of courts where law held sway over kings. They spoke of Rome, not as an empire of conquest, but as a dream woven into the hearts of men and women who believed in order, in justice, in something greater than mere survival. As darkness fell, Aurelia placed her hand upon the old chest where the final scrolls rested. "If they come," she whispered, her voice soft as the wind among the olive leaves, "and if we fall, let this remain. Let memory outlive us." Marcellinus, standing beside her, nodded. He drew his sword, not in defiance, but in salute. Decimus bowed his head, a silent vow upon his lips. When dawn broke, the Visigoths came. They swept through the land like a tide unleashed, a torrent of steel and fire. Villages burned, strongholds crumbled. And before the gates of Aurelia's villa, they paused, a sea of warriors, dark and grim beneath standards foreign to Roman eyes. The emissary who approached the gate bore neither shield nor sword. He came not as conqueror, but as messenger. He called for parley. Aurelia stood before the gate, flanked by Marcellinus and Decimus. She met the emissary's gaze with a calm that belied the storm churning within her. The man spoke in halting Latin, a language ill-fitted to his tongue, yet spoken with a strange reverence. "Our king, Uric, he knows of this place. He has heard you keep the words of Rome. He commands they be brought to him, not as plunder, but as tribute." Aurelia's heart stilled. The words fell upon her ears like a chord struck upon the edge of time itself, not as plunder, as tribute. She glanced at Marcellinus, who gave a slow nod. Decimus, too, inclined his head, eyes wide, awed. Without a word, they retrieved the chest, its weight heavy with more than parchment. They placed it before the emissary. The man took it with a bow, not of mockery, but of something deeper, something raw. Then he turned, disappearing into the ranks of his people. The villa was spared. No flames touched its walls. No swords pierced its doors. And in the years that followed, word spread, not of its fall, but of its survival. Of how even as Rome crumbled and emperors fell, a single villa in the heart of a broken land preserved the words, the memory, the soul of a world thought lost. For even in ruin, Rome endured, not in armies nor in emperors, but in hearts that refused to forget. And from those embers, carried quietly upon the wind of history, the spirit of a civilization whispered forward into the waiting hands of a world yet to be born.